let the modern world fade away. Take a deep breath, and for a moment, allow the glow of your screen, the weight of your day, and the noise of human history to slip into the background until there is only darkness and the quiet hum of your own breathing. Now imagine a different night. 66 million years ago, in what will one day be called Western North America, the late Cretaceous sky hangs over a broad, warm floodplain. This is Hell Creek, not yet a name in a geology textbook, but a living world of slow rivers, tangled forests, and the distant murmur of unseen giants moving through the dark. The air is thick with the scent of wet mud, resin from conifers, and the cool, green breath of ferns. Crickets and distant frogs stitch a soft chorus along the water's edge. Somewhere far off, a hadrosaur bellows once, then falls silent. Above the canopy, clouds gather heat and energy, and a low roll of thunder drifts over the sleeping land. In this darkness, a shape is resting. An adult Tyrannosaurus rex, 7 or 8 tons of muscle and bone, lies in a shallow hollow near a stand of trees, its massive skull resting on the ground, its chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. This is the story of its last full day on Earth, though it does not know that. For 20 years it has ruled this territory. In 24 hours, its reign, and the age of the great non-avian dinosaurs, will be within a geological instant of ending. Tonight we're going to walk beside it. We're going to follow this one animal from the quiet of this Cretaceous night, through dawn, heat, hunger, and family, all the way to the moment when a distant impact will reshape the world. We will not rush. This journey will unfold with the slow, cinematic pace of the landscape itself, each scene an invitation to observe, to imagine, and to drift. Every step we take will be grounded in what paleontology can tell us. The climate of Hell Creek's floodplains, the plants that line its rivers, the prey that browse in the half-light, the extraordinary senses that guide a T-Rex through sound, scent, and motion. But the telling will be gentle, no shocks, no horror, only calm, careful observation, even as an asteroid prepares to carve a crater and ignite an extinction. You are an invisible companion here, weightless beside the king of the dinosaurs. You can feel the faint tremor when it shifts its massive tail, hear the slow exhale through tooth-lined jaws, but nothing in this world can touch you. You are safe, free to linger over details, the pattern of scales along its flank, the rustle of cycads in the wind, the far-off flash of distant lightning. As we move through this final day, we're going to ask a quiet, unsettling question. If this day were never interrupted, if the impact missed and the dinosaurs continued their story, what kind of world would grow in the shadow of their reign? It would change everything about the future evolution of Earth, about the history that eventually produced us. For now, though, there is only the night. The king sleeps, eyes closed, senses resting, unaware that the next sunrise will be its last. Before we go any further, settle in. If this slow, calm way of wandering through deep time and the last day of a king helps you loosen your grip on the day, you are welcome to follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Only if this kind of careful storytelling soothes you. There is no urgency. The decision can be as unhurried as the river outside the floodplain. But the king does not sleep in a wasteland. Long before the first hint of dawn, 66 million years ago, Hell Creek is a warm, breathing edge of an inland sea, a subtropical world draped in darkness and humidity. The air holds the memory of a hot day and the promise of another, thick with water vapour and richer in carbon dioxide than anything your lungs have ever known. This is not the cracked desert many picture when they hear the word dinosaurs. This is a river country, a low, flat expanse of floodplains and meandering channels where mud remembers every footstep. To reach it, take a deep breath and let the modern world fade away. We're going to ask what it truly felt like to stand here, under this dense Cretaceous sky, with air thicker and richer in carbon dioxide than today, with no cities, no roads, only the slow pulse of Earth's own energy moving through water, wind, and growing wood. In the dark, you can almost hear the planet exhale. Scientists rebuild this vanished scene from fragments of rock and dust and charcoal, from grains of fossil pollen trapped in ancient mudstones, from mineralized logs that still preserve growth rings. Those rings speak of seasons, wet and hotter, wet and merely warm. Pollen grains, magnified under a microscope, map out forests and open patches, telling us which plants dominated, which faded, which returned after each flood. Layer by layer they reveal that Hell Creek was stable, thriving, cycling through years and centuries with no obvious hint of the impact that is already on its way through space. By touch and scent the vegetation closes in. Towering conifers rise above the floodplain, their trunks straight and columnar, shouldering a high canopy that filters the starlight. Between them spread broad-leaved angiosperm trees, early cousins of modern oaks and laurels, their leaves wide and dripping with condensed night air. At their feet, ferns unfurl in dense carpets, and tangled undergrowth fills the gaps, creating a mosaic of open, silty bars beside the river, and deep, shaded galleries where light barely reaches the ground. The soundscape is never silent. Frogs call from the margins of oxbow lakes, their low croaks overlapping into a soft, irregular chorus. Insects rasp and trill in the reeds, wings brushing against fronds and bark. From somewhere upstream comes the steady hush of water sliding over sandbanks, broken now and then by the muted splash of a nocturnal animal easing into the channel. Out there, in the murk, are the neighbours that share this world. Herds of hadrosaurs, Edmontosaurus, stand knee-deep in black water, resting, their tails floating, their breath rising in faint clouds. Triceratops lie in the shelter of trees, massive heads resting on the ground, frills outlined in silhouette. Smaller predators patrol the edges, two-legged shadows slipping between trunks, while flocks of primitive birds stir in the branches, feathers puffed against the damp air. Above all of this, the night sky is familiar and alien at once. The Milky Way arches overhead in a brighter, sharper band than most modern eyes ever see, constellations shifted by millions of years of stellar motion. Somewhere in that darkness, indistinguishable from a star to any watching eye, a faint point of light carries the future in its stony heart. An asteroid on a collision course that will carve a crater and nearly end this story of giant reptiles and flooded forests within a geological instant. Yet here, on the ground, the world feels calm. The ecosystem hums, balanced, unaware. We're going to stay low, near the riverbank, where the mud is cool and the scent of algae and wet clay is strong, and let our attention drift toward a darker shadow among the shadows. A massive shape resting on its side, ribs rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths. Our Tyrannosaurus rex lies there, close to the water, part of the chorus of this night, not apart from it, waiting for a dawn that will seem, at first, like any other. For a long moment, we stay there with it, in the reeds and cool mud, watching the shadow breathe. The broad chest swells, then sinks, each breath a slow tide moving under pebbled, scarred skin, the faint shiver of air sacs deep inside a body built for high-octane life in a warm Cretaceous world. The eyelids twitch now and then, heavy and reptilian, the slit of an eye glinting amber before sleep pulls it closed again. Even the tail, thick as a tree trunk at the base, gives a small, unconscious ripple in the dark. This is the story of a monarch at rest. From snout to tail tip, this Tyrannosaurus stretches more than 40 feet, the length of a city bus resting on its side in the mud. At the hips it rises 13 feet when standing, taller than most of the trees crowding the riverbank edge, and when it moves at full height, it will carry 7 or 8 tons of muscle and bone on 2 pillar-like legs. The skull alone is more than 3.5 feet long, A great wedge of bone and air spaces balanced over those hinder limbs, teeth as long as a human hand locked in jaws that can drive through solid bone with the energy of a falling boulder. We're going to let the modern world fade away for a while and look at this animal the way paleontologists do, through rock and time. Inside its bones, if we could slice a rib and polish it thin under a microscope, we would see rings, growth lines, bands of fast and slow deposition, much like the rings of a tree that has weathered many seasons. Count them, and this individual resolves into numbers, perhaps 20 years old, maybe a little more, far past its explosive teenage growth, settled into the plateau of prime adulthood, where strength is high and growth has almost stopped. Yet the skeleton would also tell a harsher part of the story. Along one side of the rib cage, several ribs are fused and thickened, healed together after a fracture that once made every breath an impact of pain. On the lower jaw, a crescent of roughened bone traces the memory of another tyrannosaur's bite. Tooth marks that sank deep, then sealed over with time. In the tail, a few vertebrae are clouded with arthritis, their joint surfaces pitted and swollen, a reminder that even the king pays a price for years of chasing, turning, colliding with prey that does not want to die. In popular imagination, Tyrannosaurus is a roaring movie monster, a mindless engine of extinction and fear. Here, in the humid dark before dawn, it is an animal, managing energy, nursing old injuries, balancing hunger against risk in a landscape full of other dinosaurs, crocodiles, and horned giants that can kill with a single swing. It must find food, yes, but it must also avoid infection, remember safe paths through the floodplain, and read the shifting signals of scent and sound that mark the borders of its territory. We are going to ask you to meet it as an individual. This tyrannosaur has a home range scored into its memory, the bend where hadrosaurs drink at dusk, the stand of conifers where it once sheltered from a storm, the distant rise where a rival's scent lingers on the wind. Over years it has learned how the earth around this river behaves when the waters rise, where the mud swallows unwary feet, which calls in the night mean opportunity and which mean danger. Its sex is harder to fix. In the fossil record, debates continue over whether the heavier, more robust tyrannosaurs were female, whether a special bone tissue used to store calcium for eggs ever truly fossilized in these giants. For our living monarch, the chromosomes are hidden, the reproductive history unknown, yet we can still infer a life threaded through with courtship displays, booming calls, the search for mates, and perhaps seasons of guarding a nest against smaller, bold-eyed thieves. When we pull back just a little, the view widens from this single body to the deep history behind it. More than 150 million years of theropod evolution stand silently in those resting muscles. From small feathered hunters sprinting under Jurassic ferns to this massive heat-pulsing predator lying by a Cretaceous river. Within a geological instant, a lineage has refined lungs, senses and brains into this apex form. A culmination that could so easily have never existed if earlier impacts, earlier extinctions, had played out differently. Take a deep breath. Above the river, the sky is beginning to thin from black to deep indigo, the first low hints of colour touching the eastern horizon. The air cools, insects pause, and along the tyrannosaur's flanks the breathing changes. The ribs lift a little higher, the eyelids tighten, the tail gives a more deliberate flex. The king's last full day on this earth is about to begin, and we're going to rise with it, step for heavy step, into a morning that will seem, for a while, utterly ordinary. The tyrannosaur rises, but we're going to zoom out from muscle and bone to something larger and quieter, the invisible borders that rise with it. Under the paling sky, this animal does not simply stand in a clearing. It stands at the heart of a domain that stretches far beyond the reach of its own sight. Tens, perhaps hundreds, of square miles of floodplain and forest, channel and marsh, all bound together in a territory only it can truly feel. To your left, in the mind's eye, broad rivers braid across the lowlands, their banks softened by years of seasonal flooding. To your right, conifer groves, fern meadows, and scattered flowering trees patchwork the land. This is not a random expanse of wilderness. It is a mapped world, a lived-in landscape, and our Tyrannosaur has walked its length so many times that every bend in the river carries a memory, every open meadow holds the echo of past hunts and narrow escapes. How large is this kingdom? There are no fences, no written records, only the bones and the physics of appetite. Paleontologists begin with mass and metabolism, with a 7 or 8-ton predator that must feed its bulk in a world where prey is scattered. They compare it to lions pacing African savannas, or polar bears crossing sea ice, and they find that the bigger the hunter, the wider the net it must cast, especially where prey herds thin and migrate. From these parallels, from tooth marks on fossil bones and the spacing of carcass sites, they infer a home range that may span an entire river basin. Within that range, certain places burn brighter in the Tyrannosaur's internal map. There is a shallow ford where the main river splits, a stony bar where the current slows and hadrosaurs must bunch together to cross, hooves slipping, flanks exposed. There is a stand of fruiting trees on a slightly raised terrace, their seasonal bounty drawing in smaller dinosaurs and mammals, which in turn draw in larger herbivores, a living constellation of bodies and scent. There is a muddy wallow tucked beneath a low bluff, fed by a stubborn seep of groundwater that persists even when drought grips the wider floodplain and the air tastes of dust. We're going to ask what it feels like to move through a world where these landmarks are not points on a human map, but anchors in a lifetime of experience. The Tyrannosaur does not navigate with ink or satellites. It follows gradients of smell, the faint iron tang of old blood near the ford, the sweet rot of fallen fruit on the terrace, the cool mineral breath rising from the shaded wallow. Each path it walks reinforces a circuit learned over years, a hunting route woven from habit and opportunity. To keep this circuit, the animal must be more than a silent shadow. Many modern predators advertise their presence not because they wish to be seen, but because conflict is costly and must be managed at a distance. Wolves rake their claws and leave scat along trails. Tigers spray trees with pungent markers. Bears rub their backs against trunks, leaving hair and scent. Our knowledge of tyrannosaurs comes from rock and bone, not preserved behaviour, yet the anatomy of their nasal passages, the complexity of their sinuses, hints at a world where smell carried information across invisible lines. Imagine this giant pausing at the edge of a clearing, tail held level, head turning slowly. It may rub its flank against a rough-barked conifer, leaving skin oils and the faint musk of a predator in its prime. It may open that massive jaw and exhale, not just to breathe, but to let the wind carry its presence downwind, a low-frequency announcement that this stretch of riverbank is watched. Some researchers have suggested that deep infrasonic calls could have rolled through the forest, barely felt more than heard, a warning and a claim woven together. These signals matter, because this kingdom is not entirely empty of rivals. Younger tyrannosaurs, leaner and less experienced, may patrol the margins, following distant scents of carcasses, testing how close they can approach before the risk outweighs the reward. Smaller theropods, feathered and quick, move through the understory and alongside channels, slipping between the footprints of the giant, scavenging its kills, avoiding its direct path. At night, their calls stitch across the floodplain, a chorus at the edges of power. Across seasons, the shape of the Tyrannosaur's world flexes. When the monsoon swells the rivers, old fords drown and new sandbars rise, and the predator's roots bend toward higher ground, toward ridges that stay dry when the lowlands turn to a shimmering insect-loud sheet of water. In drier years, when drought pulls the channels into isolated pools, the home range may contract, tightening around the last dependable water, where weakened herbivores gather in desperate concentrations. When hadrosaur herds shift their calving grounds, following fresh silt and new plant growth, the Tyrannosaur's path stretched toward those distant seasonal gatherings, extending its patrols into valleys it rarely visits in wetter times. Take a deep breath and let the modern world fade away for a moment. In this Cretaceous dawn, territory is not owned in any legal sense. There are no treaties, no surveyed boundaries, no maps etched in ink. There is only presence and memory and the raw calculus of strength and survival. The Tyrannosaur's claim is written in the frequency of its visits, in the scars it carries and the fear it inspires, in the way other bodies move when its scent brushes past their nostrils. This is the story of a domain held together by movement and by the quiet, constant pressure of a dominant predator. Within a geological instant, all of this will be tested. As the sky brightens from grey to gold, a sound threads through the half-light, a low, distant call from another large theropod, rising from somewhere near the outer river bends. It is not yet a challenge, not yet a confrontation, but it is a reminder that even here, at the heart of its realm, the king's borders are never completely secure. The answering call fades, swallowed by the soft rush of the river and the whisper of leaves, and above it all the sky continues its slow transformation. What was moments ago a deep velvety blue now thins toward indigo, then violet, then the first hesitant bands of gold along the low horizon. Within a geological instant, the world around our Tyrannosaurus rex is being repainted by light. The sun's rim lifts, distorted by humid air, and its rays slant through the canopy to touch the giant's scaly flank. Cold skin, cooled by the long merciful darkness, begins to warm. Tiny droplets of dew bead and run along the pebbled surface, catching the rising glow. The night's cool relief is ending. Heat and the demands of the day are returning. The rex stirs. Powerful leg muscles, thick as tree trunks, tense and flex beneath its mass. The great tail rises from the damp ground, swinging out and back to find balance as the animal levers itself upright. Clods of wet soil cling for a moment, then fall away. With a slow, unhurried motion, the head lifts, jaws parting in a vast, yawning gape that shows row after row of serrated teeth, still stained from old meals, steam curling from its throat into the chill air. Damp soil presses under each first step, yielding with a soft squelch. Ferns brush its ankles. There is the mineral scent of wet rock along the riverbank, the sweetness of crushed vegetation, the faint musk of hadrosaurs stirring at the forest edge. Far away, a branch cracks as some smaller dinosaur moves through the undergrowth, a detail barely worthy of attention to a 7-ton predator beginning its rounds. What draws it from rest at this precise moment? The answer lies in something you share with this animal, separated by 66 million years, yet bound by the same quiet machinery, circadian rhythms. These are internal biological clocks, patterns of activity and rest that respond to light, temperature, and the predictable cycles of Earth's rotation. In mammals, in birds, in reptiles, and almost certainly in giant theropods, these clocks help conserve energy, anticipate opportunity, and align bodies with the turning planet. We're going to ask how that clock shapes the king's day. Was Tyrannosaurus rex a creature of blazing noon, of shadowed twilight, or of flexible habits tuned to prey and climate? Its large, forward-facing eyes sit in deep sockets that hint at good vision in low light, comparable in some ways to modern big predators that favour dawn and dusk. Not strictly nocturnal, not confined to full daylight, but leaning toward the cooler, gentler edges of the day, where contrast is sharp and movement stands out. Temperature is the silent partner in this routine. As the sun climbs, the floodplain will turn heavy and hot, every breath thick with moisture. To move a body this massive costs energy, and heat only magnifies that cost. So the Rex does more when the air is forgiving. In the cool of early morning and the lengthening shadows of late afternoon, it will patrol, scout, and sometimes chase. As midday builds, it will seek shade among gallery forests or stand knee-deep in slow water, letting the river wick warmth away. This morning will follow a familiar pattern. First comes the early patrol along known game trails, nostrils wide to sample the layered scents of the night, decaying carcass somewhere downwind, fresh hadrosaur herds closer to the forest margin, the fading trace of a rival. Then a lull, a mid-morning pause on a rise where breezes move, eyes half-lidded yet always watching. There may be opportunistic hunting if a weak or unwary animal presents itself, or patient scavenging if the wind carries the iron tang of exposed flesh. As the sun leans towards its zenith, the rhythm shifts. The Rex will drift towards shade, perhaps the same cluster of conifers it has used for years, or a bend in the river where water pools cool and deep. Hours will stretch in relative stillness, broken only by minor adjustments, a shake of the head to dislodge insects, a low rumble to warn a juvenile tyrannosaur straying too close. Then, as the light softens and colours lengthen, the internal clock will nudge it back to motion, priming muscles and senses for renewed activity toward evening. We are going to let the modern world fade away for a moment and sit with the ordinariness of this dawn. For the Rex, there is nothing special here. This is the story of one more morning in a long sequence of mornings repeated across years of dominance on this floodplain. The same paths, the same scents, the same distant rustle of hadrosaurs rising from their night beds among the trees. That ordinariness is precisely what will make the coming disruption feel so impossible, so abrupt when it arrives. Take a deep breath and walk beside it now, in your imagination. The Rex turns from its resting place and steps onto a familiar game trail, a corridor of trampled ferns and exposed soil winding along the river's edge. Each slow, purposeful stride is a decision. To follow this scent rather than that, to move upstream instead of down, to ignore for now the fading call of the rival near the outer bends. The day's first choices are already being made, subtle adjustments that will, in ways no dinosaur could ever sense, shape how it meets the first distant signals of an impact that will threaten to end its world. Now we're going to rise up with it, into the air above the floodplain, and see this world through a predator's eyes. From nearly 13 feet at the hip, and higher still at the crown of the skull, the ground falls away into a broad green mosaic of channels, sandbars, and forested ridges, all laid out beneath the slow sweep of a tyrannosaur's gaze. The head moves only slightly, but the view is immense. Each eye, set deep in a bony socket, looks out across miles of river valley, over herds of hadrosaurs wading in the shallows, over the armoured backs of ankylosaurs grinding through ferns near the tree line. Forward-facing, those eyes overlap. That overlap is binocular vision, two images fused into one, and from that fusion comes depth. The ability to tell not only that a hadrosaur is there, but exactly how far away its shoulder is, how high to lift a foot to clear a fallen trunk, how much space remains before a charging body must commit. We are going to ask what it means, in practical terms, to be a dinosaur with such eyes. Tyrannosaurus rex had orbits broad and rounded, with supporting bones thickened into struts, making room for eyes that, in life, would have rivaled the largest of modern eagles and owls. Large eyes gather more light. In the muted glow of dawn, or under the dim canopy of a Cretaceous forest, that extra light draws out detail, the flex of a tendon in a hadrosaur's leg, the trembling of a branch where a smaller predator slips away. Colour too would have shaped this view. We do not have its retina, only the rock of its skull, but birds and reptiles, its living relatives, often see a richer spectrum than we do, extending into ultraviolet. It would change everything about how this landscape appears. Feathers, scales, and leaves could blaze with signals invisible to human eyes, subtle patterns on a rival's snout, the flushed throat of a displaying mate, the sheen of fresh growth along a riverbank, all legible to a brain tuned by millions of years of selection. Movement breaks the stillness. A ripple of hadrosaurs in the distance, the sudden dart of a small mammal between roots, a pterosaur lifting from a sandbar as the Tyrannosaur's shadow approaches. Against the slow sway of conifers and broad-leaved angiosperms, anything that twitches, flares, or flees is pulled out, highlighted by a nervous system primed to notice change. But vision is not only for the hunt. This is the story of a lifetime spent in one territory, and these eyes know it. The crooked snag near the oxbow, the pale scar of an old landslide on a distant bluff, the particular pattern of gaps in the canopy that marks the safest path through denser forest, all serve as landmarks. The posture of another T-Rex at the edge of sight, a head held high in challenge or low in wary avoidance, carries meaning long before scent or sound arrive. You, listening now, can let the modern world fade away while you picture that clarity, even as your own eyes are closed or half closed. Take a deep breath. You do not need to stay alert. The Tyrannosaur will watch the floodplain for you, every contour and shadow mapped in exquisite detail. As the sun climbs and the day brightens, new challenges appear. Glare flashes from open water, white fire scattered from the river's surface, and from pale sandbars baked by heat. The predator shifts its path toward the broken shade of gallery forests, choosing angles where reflections soften and contrast returns, where its vision is once again most effective. On a low rise above a sweeping meander, the animal pauses. It stands, a dark silhouette against the sky, and slowly turns its head, scanning. The camera moves in, closer and closer, until there is only the unblinking eye, filling the frame. A living lens that will, within a geological instant, register a second sun blooming on the horizon, the first silent flash of an impact that will carve a crater and threaten to end its world. The great eye blinks once, and as the light strengthens, another sense takes command. The Tyrannosaurus lifts its massive skull, vertebrae locking in a slow, deliberate arc, and inhales. Nostrils flare. In the humid morning air above the floodplain, invisible scent trails twist and curl, thin rivers of information flowing into a brain that has been tuned by millions of years of evolution to read them. We're going to ask what it means to live in a world where smell is as sharp and detailed as sight. Inside the skull, behind those forward-facing eyes, sit enlarged olfactory bulbs, swollen lobes of nervous tissue that, in life, glowed with blood and electrical activity. In cross-section, they rival those of modern vultures and wolves, animals whose entire existence depends on detecting opportunity at a distance. For T-Rex, the impact of that anatomy is simple. It can map its world with its nose. Take a deep breath and imagine the air as the animal experiences it. From miles away, carried by shifting breezes over open floodplains and through stands of conifers, come the layered signals of this Cretaceous morning. There is the broad, living smell of a hadrosaur herd, warm and musky, edged with the green bitterness of crushed ferns and cycads on their hides. Threaded through that is the sharper metallic tang of blood and the first sweet-sour note of decay, a recent kill somewhere out of sight, perhaps dragged into gallery forest shade by smaller predators in the night. The Tyrannosaur stands almost motionless, but its head is not still. It samples the air the way a shark samples water, making small, careful adjustments, turning a few degrees into or away from faint scent gradients, one side, then the other. Each shift lets it compare concentrations, tiny differences in odor that sketch out a map of carcasses, herds, and rivals. This is the story of a landscape written not in colors or lines, but in chemicals. When the hunt succeeds, taste takes over as a second, slower sense. Serrated teeth, each one a blade with microscopic saw edges, tear through skin and muscle, shearing tendons, cracking bone. Saliva mixes with blood and liquefied marrow, carrying fats and proteins over the tongue. In that moment, the animal learns, again and again, which tissues offer the richest energy for the least effort. The nutrient-dense organs, the soft muscle at joints, the fat deposits that will carry it through leaner weeks. For years, we're going to hear debates about whether Tyrannosaurus was a hunter or a scavenger. Here, in its own world, the distinction loses its edge. With a nose this powerful, with the ability to detect a carcass from many miles away, ignoring free meat would be biologically unlikely. A fresh kill, a stolen kill, a half-rotten windfall at the edge of a drying channel. To this animal, they're all just different patterns in the same chemical tapestry. Smell is not only about food. Certain scents on the wind mean danger. The rank, oily musk of another large tyrannosaur, a rival whose presence is written in old scars along this animal's jaw. Other smells are promises that return with the seasons, year after year. The dense, earthy odour of nesting grounds where hadrosaurs dig shallow craters for their eggs. The trampled, grassy corridors that mark migration paths toward higher, cooler ground. Each one is anchored in memory, in a private history of hunger answered and wounds avoided. Now, as the sun lifts higher and the insects begin their midday chorus, something new arrives on the breeze. The tyrannosaur pauses, nostrils widening, head tilting a fraction. Not the acrid bite of smoke from a distant fire, not yet the strange atmospheric tang that will follow an asteroid's impact, but the deep, living smell of a large herbivore herd moving through its territory. Musky, green-edged, pulsing with warm blood and potential energy. The decision is quiet, almost invisible from the outside. With a slow exhale, the animal turns toward that promise and begins to walk. But before the hunt truly begins, something else happens. The tyrannosaur pauses mid-stride, one massive foot planted in the damp alluvium, head lifting, tilting slightly, jaws parted just enough to still the breath. To our ears, the world is quiet. To its ears, the world is crowded. This is the story of a living earth speaking in sound. Deep inside the skull, coiled in darkness, the inner ear of Tyrannosaurus is long and delicately tuned. Its bony canals stretched in a way that tells us it was especially sensitive to low notes, to the slow rolling waves of energy that pass more through bone and soil than through air. Where you might only hear a faint rustle of leaves, this animal can feel the distant footfalls of a hadrosaur herd, thudding through the floodplain sediments miles away. We're going to ask what the Cretaceous soundscape truly was in these last calm hours before the impact. There is the constant murmur of the river, chewing at its own banks, the distant rumble of large herbivores shifting as one, a living landslide of muscle and horn. Trees creak and crash as old trunks surrender to rot and wind. Above, the sharp cries of birds thread through the heavier wing beats and hoarse calls of pterosaurs cruising the warm air. All around, an insect hiss, a soft electrical buzz, fills the spaces between larger noises, turning silence into a rare and meaningful event. Take a deep breath and let the modern world fade away. On this ancient earth, not all sound is meant for human ears. Below the lowest note of a piano, below what we would call hearing, lie waves so slow they are felt as pressure rather than tone. We call this infrasound, sound waves too low for us to hear, but strong enough to vibrate chests and shake leaves. Modern elephants send infrasound calls across savannas. Crocodilians let loose deep bellows that ripple through water and mud, messages carried farther than sight. By comparison, the tyrannosaur's anatomy hints at a similar talent. Long inner ear canals for low frequencies, a heavy skull that could couple to the ground. It may have produced calls that were less a roar than a rolling presence, a deep resonant pulse that moved through the floodplain, through bone and bark and water, more felt in the chest than heard in the ears. Imagine standing near that throat as it spoke. The air would thicken around you. With such hearing, sound becomes a map. Hidden by forest, a hadrosaur herd is invisible, but their weight on the saturated soil gives them away. The Tyrannosaur shifts its head, tiny ear openings on either side of the skull sampling minute differences in arrival time, triangulating the source the way modern owls and alligators do. A sudden, frantic splashing somewhere downriver betrays an animal crossing in panic, long before scent or sight can confirm it. Each noise is a coordinate, each vibration a line on an invisible grid. Hearing is not only for hunger, it is also for safety. Over millions of years, this predator has learned the background music of its world, the constant insect chorus, the low grumble of distant thunder, the breathy calls of nesting hadrosaurs, the wing beats of pterosaurs tracing the river. When that music changes, it would change everything. A sudden silence in the canopy can mean another predator, or a flood surge, or a falling tree. Familiar noise is reassurance that the rules of the world still hold. Within a geological instant, those rules will be tested. Far beyond the curve of the horizon, a rock has already met the ocean, carving a crater into the crust, releasing more energy than any storm this planet has ever seen. Long before light and ash reach this valley, the first messenger will be sound, an odd rolling pressure wave, infrasound from an impact half a continent away, arriving as a distant, directionless unease in the bones of every animal that can feel it. For now, though, the Tyrannosaur hears only what it expects, the layered chorus, the gentle thunder of life. Then, beneath it all, a faint rhythmic thudding separate from its own pulse, too regular to be random, many feet moving together, a herd on the move somewhere beyond the tree line. The great head turns, nostrils flaring, but the decision comes first from the ears. In this late Cretaceous world, sound is not background. It is guidance. It is opportunity. And once more, quietly, the king begins to walk. But the king is not the only one walking. Beneath the steady rhythm of its own footfalls, there are traces of other journeys pressed into the mud, some softened by last night's rain, some crisp and sharp-edged, laid down only hours ago. Parallel claw marks where another tyrannosaur paced a riverbank, looping turns where a younger animal hesitated, the faint drag of a heavy tail at the edge of a sandbar. To our eyes, they would be a tangle of impressions. To this animal, they are sentences in a language written by weight and direction and age. Smell completes what the ground begins. On the damp air ride threads of scent, an older mark, fading and thin from a rival that passed days earlier, a sharper, more recent trace that clings to low branches, the musk of a subadult whose territory brushes the margins of this one. Somewhere out there, beyond the tree line, another mind hears the same distant herd, feels the same pull of hunger, and measures distance, risk, and opportunity against the presence of this older, heavier body. We are going to ask how alone a tyrannosaur really was. For years, paleontologists treated these predators as solitary monsters, but the rocks tell a quieter, more complicated story. In related theropods, there are nesting grounds frozen in time, rings of eggs scraped into shallow bowls, surrounded by the impressions of feathered limbs and crouched bodies. Some fossils preserve juveniles and adults together, growth stages stacked in a single layer of sediment, suggesting broods guarded and led rather than abandoned to chance. If smaller, earlier cousins watched over their nests, it would change everything about how we imagine this animal's life. T-Rex eggs have not yet been found in a neat circle, but the growth rings in their bones show that juveniles spent years racing through adolescence. Their limbs long and slender, their skulls narrow, their bite still powerful but tuned for speed and smaller prey. We're going to imagine this adult not as an eternal solitary hunter, but as a parent that may once have walked these same trails with a retinue of long-legged half-sized shadows. Picture them, a cluster of youngsters weaving around its feet, darting after ornithomimids and small hadrosaurs, testing their balance in the flooded forests of this late Cretaceous world. They would have been faster than the adult, lighter on their toes, their role in the ecosystem distinct, chasing what a 7-ton giant would ignore, learning through imitation which sounds meant danger, which scents meant carcass, which silhouettes on the horizon meant competition. Competition leaves marks. On some Tyrannosaur skulls, healed gouges from teeth as large as bananas run across the snout and jaw, arcs of pressure where bone was crushed and then remodelled, testimony to battles that did not end in extinction but in dominance, bite marks on ribs and hip bones, matching Tyrannosaur teeth, tell of intraspecific combat, of disputes over carcasses or over access to mates, of lunges that slipped from threat display into contact. Our adult may carry such scars beneath its feathers and scales, thickened ridges of bone under the skin where an old rival once closed its jaws and then eventually let go. Yet these interactions were not fixed alliances or permanent pacts. The social world of T-Rex, as far as we can read it from Rock and Bone, was probably a mosaic of brief meetings and long silences. Temporary congregations formed around a dead hadrosaur, where 3 or 4 tyrannosaurs might circle and feed in uneasy truce. Short courtship seasons when calls and scents drew individuals together for days or weeks, followed by long years of solitary patrol along familiar rivers and floodplains. Somewhere near the edge of this territory, a subadult waits in the shade of conifers, listening to the same morning chorus of insects and distant herbivore footfalls. Its bones are still growing rapidly, its legs proportionally longer, its skull not yet the deep, crushing wedge of full adulthood. Its future is tied to the choices of the older animal now moving through the forest, whether the adult tolerates its presence at a carcass, whether it drives it away from prime hunting grounds, whether, in the next breeding season, it becomes rival or mate. This is the story of a lineage, not an isolated terror. Whatever the exact social structure, this tyrannosaur is a node in a living network, its genes braided with those of past and future generations, its behaviours honed by millions of years of trial, error and survival. Within a geological instant, individuals are born and die, but the pattern persists, echoing down the ages in bone and track and tooth. Take a deep breath and let the modern world fade away for a moment. Listen to the forest with the same patient attention as the king. On the wind, almost too low to notice at first, there is a sound, a drawn-out infrasonic call, rising and then falling, threaded through with harmonics that vibrate in the chest more than in the ears. The great head tilts, one eye narrowing, nostrils flaring. Far away, beyond the next bend in the river, another tyrannosaur waits, its own path slowly curving toward this one. The answering call hangs in the air for a heartbeat longer, then dissolves into the background hum of insects and rustling leaves, a promise that before this day is done, these two trajectories may intersect. For a moment, the answering call of the distant tyrannosaur seems to be the whole world. Then the sound thins, dissolving back into the rustle of leaves and the low hiss of wind over water, and the forest opens up beyond our hunter, revealing that this is not a kingdom ruled by one creature alone. Ahead, the trees part into a broad, sunlit meadow, its floor carpeted with ferns and low cycads. Here, a herd of Edmontosaurus hadrosaurs grazes in slow motion, their beaked mouths sweeping through the greenery, their long tails swaying in an almost tidal rhythm. Every few heartbeats, one lifts its head, chewing, eyes half closed, listening to the soft murmur of the others and to the distant impact of waves against a sandbar far downriver. This is the story of energy moving from leaf to muscle, from quiet grazing to the potential for sudden flight. Beyond them, closer to the shadowed edge of the conifers, another presence anchors the scene: Triceratops, massive, low-slung bodies, each one a walking fortress of bone and muscle, heavy forelimbs planted wide, hips rolling with each step. The great frills rise above the fern tops like mobile shields, edged in knobs and scallops, while 3 forward-pointing horns cast long, dark spears of shadow across their faces. Their herd moves cautiously, never fully relaxed, every turn of the head an act of scanning, every flick of the tail a punctuation mark in a silent conversation about danger. These giants are not passive decorations in the landscape. They are the engines that reshape it. As they strip branches bare, whole curtains of foliage vanish within minutes, sunlight spearing into places that were dim for years. Their feet churn the mud of the floodplain, trampling seedlings, carving paths that channel rainwater, turning undergrowth into open corridors. Clearings appear where they linger, and in those open spaces a T-Rex can move more easily, can see further, can let its keen eyes and nose triangulate the weak pulse of opportunity. We're going to ask how often this tyrant actually attacks such formidable neighbours. How often does it gamble 7 tons of flesh and bone against a forest of horns, or the stampede of a hadrosaur herd? More often, it simply follows, keeping downwind, letting its world-class sense of smell trace the invisible wake of these herds, waiting for a limp, a stumble, a calf that drifts a little too far from its mother. Around these giants, a smaller caste moves in the margins. Swift raptor-like theropods, feathered and bright-eyed, thread through the ferns, hunting lizards and insects watching for scraps. In the trees, tiny mammals with grasping hands, early primate relatives, test branches with careful steps, their dark eyes reflecting shards of sky. Underfoot, burrowing mammals vanished into the safety of their tunnels, emerging only to snatch fallen seeds and the occasional insect, each lineage holding to its narrow slice of the Hell Creek world. Near the rivers and oxbow lakes, other predators wait. Dromaeosaurs, sickle-clawed and wary, trail the big herds at a distance, their own hunts scale to juveniles and the injured. In the water, crocodilians drift in near-perfect stillness, only their nostrils and eyes breaking the surface, ready to seize anything that ventures too close to the muddy bank. When a carcass falls, these opportunists converge, competing not just with each other, but with the Tyrannosaur whose bite can crack bone, and whose presence can clear a feeding ground in deep time. When the T-Rex steps from the trees, even at a distance, the entire soundscape changes. Heads snap up among the hadrosaurs, tails stiffen, the easy rhythm of grazing breaks into a staccato of nervous footfalls and wet, huffing snorts. Triceratops form a loose wall, horns angled outward, calves shuffling toward the centre of the living shield. The meadow, moments ago a place of quiet chewing and insect hum, tightens into a single-held breath. Take a deep breath yourself and let the modern world fade away. This is not chaos. This is a complete functioning ecosystem, an ancient circuit of energy that has persisted for millions of years on this warm, forested earth. From sunlight to fern, from fern to hadrosaur, from hadrosaur to tyrannosaur, then on to the smallest scavenger and the unseen bacteria in the soil. Our T-Rex pauses at the edge of the clearing, massive head tilted, watching the distant wall of Triceratops horns and the restless sea of Edmontosaurus backs. For now, it does not commit. The day is long, the herds will move, and weakness has a way of revealing itself. As the sun climbs higher and the air shimmers over the floodplain, the uneasy balance between predator and prey holds, stretched but unbroken, a tension that defines this world and will for a few hours more endure. The tension holds, and so the great predator does what it does on most uneventful mornings in this warm, late Cretaceous world. It walks, not in a frantic charge, not in the explosive sprint that fills so many imaginations, but in a measured rolling gait that carries 7 tons of muscle and bone across the floodplain with quiet efficiency. Each step is a long, deliberate stride, hips rising and falling in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, tail counterbalancing the skull as if the whole body were a living metronome. The ground trembles, but not violently. It pulses, a steady drumbeat through mud and sand. If you let the modern world fade away for a moment and match your breathing to those footsteps, in and out, you can feel how much distance is being eaten up with so little apparent effort. We're going to ask what it costs in raw energy to move a body this large through space. Metabolism is the word biologists use for the chemistry of life, the way food is turned into the fuel that powers every heartbeat and every step. In small mammals, that chemistry burns hot and fast. In reptiles, it slows, saving energy but limiting activity. Large theropod dinosaurs, including Tyrannosaurus, seem to have occupied an in-between state, with bird-like lungs and rapid growth hinting at an elevated, warm metabolism that never quite reaches the frantic pace of a mouse. Over years, that compromise would shape everything about this animal's day. Some estimates suggest an adult T-Rex might need tens of thousands of calories in a single day or spread across a week if it fed more intermittently. The exact number is debated, but the order of magnitude is clear. This is the story of an engine that cannot ever be turned fully off, a furnace of living tissue that must be fed by bone-rich carcasses and the occasional catastrophic kill. To keep that furnace burning, walking is the default mode. A slow patrol across its territory, head low to the wind, is far cheaper than a chase. With each unhurried stride, it can follow fading scent trails, listen for the distant panic of hadrosaurs, or simply move into deeper shade as the sun climbs higher. Running, in contrast, is a violent spike of cost, a sprint that floods its muscles with heat and waste, something to be used rarely and with care. Biomechanical studies, using digital skeletons and muscle models, suggest that Tyrannosaurus could move quickly when it truly needed to, perhaps reaching speeds that would leave a human runner far behind, but that long, drawn-out pursuits would be dangerous. Tendons, joints, and the sheer stress of impact with each step impose limits. It could dash, surge, and cut off a panicked animal, yet a marathon chase across the floodplain would risk injury and exhaustion in a world where one broken leg is a slow extinction. So every decision is a calculation of energy. Do you pursue that distant herd now, when the air is already hot and the wind is wrong? Or do you conserve your reserves for a better angle, a weaker target, a cooler hour? We're going to follow this animal through those choices, but for now, it chooses restraint. The Edmontosaurus backs on the horizon are too far, the risk too great for the likely reward. Take a deep breath and match it again to the slow rise and fall of those massive hips, in and out. One step, then another, then another. The Tyrannosaur turns, angling not toward the fleeing herd but toward the river corridor, where shade, scent, and the promise of easier opportunity wait downstream, along the patient arc of its measured walk. Downstream, the air changes. The open heat of the floodplain gives way to pockets of shade and the cool breath of the river, and the Tyrannosaur's pace slows, not from fatigue, but focus. The massive head lifts and tilts, nostrils flaring, as faint, familiar odours coil through the humid air. Old blood, dried hide, sun-baked fat, the thin chalk of weathered bone. We're going to follow that head now, more than the feet. The great skull swings over a scuffed patch of ground where, days before, another kill was dragged and opened. Jaws part just a little, tendons along the cheeks and throat flexing, as the animal tests not only scent but taste and vibration, letting information flow in through every available opening. To you, it is a quiet moment. To the dinosaur, it is a calculation written in pressure and smell. We're going to ask what those jaws can do when they finally close. Engineers and paleontologists working with fossil skulls and digital models have estimated that a full-force bite from Tyrannosaurus could exceed 30 or even 60,000 newtons of pressure, enough to drive teeth through solid bone, to turn the limb of a hadrosaur into a cracked, splintered lever in a single, decisive crunch. On land, in the long history of Earth, almost nothing has matched that impact. For that to be possible, the skull itself must be more than a simple box of bone. Thick struts reinforce the snout and the sides of the face. Interlocking joints stitch the skull roof to the cheeks and the palate, turning many bones into one functional unit. Yet between these dense regions, small flexing joints and complex sutures act as shock absorbers, bleeding off destructive energy so that each bite does not fracture the predator's own head. Rigidity and give fuse together into a living machine. Within that frame, the teeth stand out, deep-rooted, thick and gently curved, more banana than blade. Their edges are lined with serrations, tiny repeating notches that turn each tooth into a row of steak knives fused into one. They are not instruments of delicate slicing. They are anchors, hooks that grip and hold as the jaw closes, as muscle and momentum do the real tearing. Feeding, for this animal, is a whole-body act. The neck is a column of muscle and ligament, capable of driving the head down into a carcass and then pulling back with explosive force, while the hind limbs brace and the tail counters the recoil. A bite, a twist, a backward heave of 7 or 8 tons of mass, and entire slabs of meat shear free. When the prey is already dead, body weight becomes a lever, not a weapon. Evidence of that power survives in unexpected places. In fossilized droppings from tyrannosaurs, paleontologists have found dense fragments of bone, shattered and partially digested. This is about an animal that does not merely break bones to reach the soft tissues, but swallows those fragments, extracting marrow and minerals that lesser bites would leave behind. More gracile theropods on this floodplain, with narrower skulls and finer teeth, may have focused on softer organs and muscle, avoiding the heavy architecture of ribs and pelvis. Tyrannosaurus, by contrast, is a hypercarnivore tuned to use every part of a kill, from hide to limb to spine. In a world where extinction waits in distant, unseen craters and no resource can be wasted, that efficiency would change everything. And yet, for the predator itself, there is no drama in this, no cruelty. This is simply eating, the quiet arithmetic of survival played out in flesh and bone, as ordinary to the Tyrannosaur as bread and fruit are to you. If you let the modern world fade away for a moment, you can feel how unremarkable it is here, under the slow turning of late Cretaceous skies. At the old kill site, the promise of food dissolves. Only scattered, sun-bleached bones remain, light as driftwood, their grease long since leached by insects and rain. The Tyrannosaur lowers its head, jaws closing experimentally on a dry fragment. The tooth marks it, leaves cross older grooves from earlier meals. There is no taste worth pursuing, no energy left to claim. The skull lifts again, the great predator turning from the empty clearing, and begins to follow the river toward fresher scents, and the next, unseen chapter of its day. The river leads it on until the forest parts again, opening into a wide, exposed bend where the water gleams under the full weight of the sun. By now, that sun is almost directly overhead, no longer golden but harsh and white, pouring down in a steady, unrelenting sheet. The air itself feels thick, as if the whole world has been warmed from the inside, and the distance over the floodplain trembles with a slow, liquid shimmer of heat haze. Insects buzz more loudly now, their wings a constant needling tremor around leaves and water, rising and falling in invisible clouds. Even the shadows beneath the ferns seem to quiver. Each breath the Tyrannosaur draws is warm before it reaches the lungs, and the earlier energy in its stride gives way to something more economical, each step measured, each movement chosen. Midday in this Cretaceous lowland is not a time for heroics. It is a time for endurance. Ahead, a stand of broad-leaved trees leans over a steeper bank, their roots clutching the soil above a slow, green backwater. The T-Rex angles toward them with quiet certainty, drawn by memory and instinct to the promise of shade. Under the canopy, the light softens from white to muted green, and the temperature drops by a degree or two, just enough to matter to a 7-ton body wrapped in muscle and skin. It lowers itself carefully along the slope, forelimbs tucked, tail settling as a counterweight, until its chest and belly are close to the cooler ground. Here, in the dimmer air, it can release heat more slowly, letting the difference between its hot core and the shaded world around it do some of the work. This is thermoregulation in action, the quiet physics that all large animals obey. Some pant, moving air rapidly over moist surfaces. Some wade into water, letting liquid draw heat away. Some, like this predator, simply adjust their day, hunting harder at dawn and dusk, resting when the sun is at its peak. We are going to ask you, as the Tyrannosaur settles, to mirror it for a moment. Take a deep breath and feel the contrast between the purposeful stride that brought it here and this still, conserving posture. Muscles that were engines a short while ago are now reservoirs, hoarding energy for later. The ribs move more slowly. The throat opens a little wider with each exhale. Far above the canopy, beyond the comforting blue of the sky, an asteroid is now only hours from impact. A rock that would change everything, racing silently through the dark. Yet from the ground, from this shaded hollow on this warm piece of earth, nothing seems different or threatening. This traces a world that does not yet know it is on the brink. If the Tyrannosaur could look straight up, it might notice that the sun's edge is ever so slightly softened, its brilliance veiled by faint high-altitude streaks. Fine dust from earlier, smaller impacts from distant volcanic eruptions hangs in the upper atmosphere, tracing thin, pale lines that barely register against the light. To the dinosaur's eyes, half closed now, they are just another detail in a familiar sky. Around it, the quiet of midday deepens. Hadrosaurs stand drowsing in the shade of a gallery forest downstream, their tails resting, their calls reduced to the occasional soft murmur. Triceratops lie in the shelter of the low rises, their great heads lowered, frills tilted to catch whatever breeze drifts by. Birds in the branches above the Tyrannosaur have fallen mostly silent, hopping only to adjust their grip or preen a feather. The soundscape narrows to the persistent hum of insects, the whisper of leaves, and the irregular splash of something turning in the slow water. We are going to settle in for a moment here, for a few breaths, and sit inside the ordinariness of this moment. In a universe without the incoming rock, this would be one of thousands of similar hot, sleepy afternoons in this animal's life, a forgettable page in a long, unwritten history. The Tyrannosaur's eyes slip further closed, nictitating membranes ghosting across the pupils as its jaw slackens and the heavy muscles along its neck relax. The camera lingers, then begins to rise, drifting up through the layered leaves, past darting insects and resting birds, until only the canopy remains, then the bright, innocent-looking sky beyond. It is a simple blue vault with a softened sun and a few high streaks of dust and ice. Behind that calm surface, across millions of years, a lethal secret is falling toward this place, toward this river, toward this resting king. Take a deep breath and drift here for a while. We pull back from the sleeping tyrant on the riverbank, from the slow rise and fall of that massive chest, and we're going to widen our view until this single day becomes just one beat in a much larger rhythm. Around this resting T-Rex, the Hell Creek floodplain moves through cycles that have repeated for countless years. Wet seasons that swell the rivers and drown the lowlands, dry seasons that crack the mud and concentrate life along shrinking channels. In the wet months, distant thunderstorms roll across the warm continent, feeding braided rivers that spill over their banks, laying down fresh layers of sand and silt. Forests of conifers and flowering trees drink deeply. Ferns unfurl in the dim undergrowth, and great herds of hadrosaurs wade through flooded groves, their calls echoing under a heavy, humid sky. In the dry months, those same channels retreat into narrow, winding ribbons, exposing sandbars where our Tyrannosaur patrols, following the scent of carcasses trapped in shrinking pools. The climate here, in the last part of the Cretaceous, is warm and forgiving. There are no ice caps at the poles, no grinding glaciers, no hint of the ice ages that will come tens of millions of years later. Winters are mild, summers long, and the gradient from equator to pole is gentle, turning Earth into a greenhouse world where dinosaurs thrive from northern forests to southern swamps. We're going to ask how we can know any of this standing so far away in time. The answers are written in the rocks. Tiny differences in oxygen isotopes locked into the shells of fossilized clams and the enamel of dinosaur teeth tell us about ancient temperatures, about water warm enough to feel almost bath-like along these coasts. Growth rings in petrified trees, and even in the bones of dinosaurs themselves reveal seasons of plenty and of relative scarcity. Each ring a record of one more year survived. Layer upon layer of mudstone and sandstone stacked in predictable patterns show cycles of flood and drought, the river wandering back and forth across its plain. Within these patterns, life moves in step. Hadrosaur herds migrate along familiar routes, following the greenest vegetation, their nesting grounds timed to the safest parts of the year, when floods are unlikely and predators are busy elsewhere. Triceratops choose higher, drier ground for their nests, banking on stability. Our T-Rex adjusts with the seasons, in the wet, scavenging along drowned forests, in the dry, ambushing thirsty prey at the last reliable waterholes. There is change here, but it is slow, almost comforting. Species appear and disappear over millions of years. That quiet background extinction is part of the story of life, balanced by new forms evolving to fill old roles. Dinosaurs have already endured earlier impacts, shifting continents, rising and falling seas. For more than 150 million years they have dominated this world, riding out crises that would have ended other empires. From the inside, this feels permanent. To a creature that measures time in hunting seasons and mating years, these warm floodplains might as well last forever. Yet from a cosmic vantage point, it would change everything to nudge a single rock by a tiny fraction in space. Somewhere beyond that calm blue sky, a small, bright object has already been set on its long, invisible path. It is still distant, still harmless, but its energy is committed now, its future crater already written into the crust of the Earth, and it is falling toward this thriving, unsuspecting world. Far below that distant falling rock, the day in Hell Creek tilts quietly toward evening. The hard white glare of noon softens, the sun slips lower, and the shadows of conifers and broad-leaved understory plants draw out across the floodplain, turning the ground into slow-moving bands of light and shade. In a pocket of dappled darkness, our Tyrannosaurus begins to wake. Heat is bleeding from the air, not gone, but easing, as if some great hand has turned the furnace down a single notch. Dust motes drift in the slanting beams, insects hum, and the heavy chest of the resting predator rises and falls in deep, unhurried breaths. Then, with a low rustle of leaves and the faint grind of bone against bone, she stirs. She plants one massive clawed foot, then the other, leaving 7 tons of muscle and bone upright. Vertebrae flex, tail muscles tighten to counterbalance the skull. She stretches, neck lifting, jaws opening in a slow, silent yawn that shows the worn, bone-crushing teeth. A rain of old leaves and dry twigs slides from her back and hips as she gives a brief full-body shake, sending a puff of dust into the amber light. She stands still for a moment, testing the world again. Nostrils flare. Each breath is deliberate, drawing in long streams of scented air, passing them over the elaborate labyrinth of nasal passages and into olfactory bulbs the size of a human fist. She samples the fading heat, the resin of wounded conifers, the distant musk of hadrosaurs, the faint iron tang of a carcass already hours old. Let's ask, in this quiet, whether anything feels different now. Is there the barest hint of a change in pressure, a delicacy in the air that no animal here has words for? High above, where even this giant's eyes cannot reach, a pterosaur wheels, catching a narrow, pale streak against the blue. A contrail, thin and ghostly, hangs for a moment in the upper atmosphere, then frays and vanishes. To the pterosaur it is nothing at all. To us, watching from a longer perspective, everything afterward would be different. In the real physics of impact, the first true effects will arrive brutally, in deep time. A flash, a shock wave, a rain of incandescent rock. But in this story, we linger in this liminal afternoon, on the knife edge between ordinary and extraordinary, and step out of the day so we can walk beside her without haste. She moves off, resuming her patrol with the calm assurance of an animal that has done this for years. Her path bends toward a low-lying basin where groundwater gathers, where herds of triceratops and duck-billed dinosaurs often converge in the late afternoon to drink and to churn the mud into a broad, trampled mirror. She does not know that the number of such evenings remaining can now be counted in hours. The soundscape is subtly sharper. Somewhere in the middle distance, wood fibres protest and fail with a dry crack as a long-dead tree finally surrenders to gravity and collapses into the undergrowth. A knot of small mammals explodes from a tangle of roots. Their alarm calls thin and urgent, while a flock of bird-like dinosaurs lifts abruptly from a sandbar, wings beating, throats rattling in chorus. All of it can be explained by ordinary causes: a shifting bank, a lurking crocodile, a passing shadow. Yet there is a faint, nameless tension in the pattern. If you take a deep breath here, following the slow rhythm of the T-Rex, you can feel the day itself leaning, as if some invisible tide has turned. This follows a whirl that still believes in its own continuity, even as the clock winds down. We'll move with her now, step by heavy step, as she climbs a low ridge of packed sediment and ancient roots. The sun has dropped closer to the horizon, its light now a deep, molten gold that edges every scale and filament in soft fire. She pauses at the crest. For a heartbeat, she is a dark, perfect silhouette against the lowering sun, tail and skull framed in luminous haze. Beyond her the valley opens wide and peaceful, water shining, herds grazing, pterosaurs drifting on gentle thermals. It is a tranquil scene, complete and self-contained. Soon we'll witness the first unmistakable sign that something impossible is happening in the sky. For now, the camera holds on this quiet tableau, on the calm before impact, on a valley that will, in a single flash, be written into the cratered history of the Earth. Beneath that tranquil valley, beneath the sweeping gaze of the Tyrannosaurus far above, the world is busier than it appears. In the dim green half-light under the conifers and broadleaf trees, another kingdom moves through shadows and fern fronds, a layered community of hunters that survives in the margins of the giant's domain. This concerns the smaller predators of Hell Creek. Feathered dromaeosaurs, close cousins of the later velociraptor, slip through the undergrowth on sickle-clawed feet, their tails held stiff as living counterweights. Troodontids, big-eyed and fine-boned, pause beneath cycads, heads tilting as they listen for the faint rustle of a lizard or mammal. Early birds, toothed and long-tailed, flick between low branches, their wings catching stray beams of late-morning sun as they watch the forest floor for insects and scraps of meat. Each has found a way to live in the shadow of the king. Dromaeosaurs patrol the edges of hadrosaur herds, testing for weakness, nipping at juveniles, or more often trailing behind the big kills of larger theropods, ready to dart in when the danger is past. Troodontids rely on keen hearing and night-friendly eyes, hunting at dawn, at dusk, and deep into the dark hours when the giant Tyrannosaurus is less active. The birds are lighter still, feeding on beetles that chew old bones, on bits of tendon left clinging where even a T-Rex bite has not quite stripped the rock-hard skeleton clean. We drift down into this tangle of fern and horsetail. The air is damp, close to the ground, rich with the smell of mud and fallen leaves. A dromaeosaur slips between horsetail stems, almost silent, its feathers dark with moisture. It follows a scent trail of iron and decay to a half-buried triceratops carcass, a place where the great jaws have already done their work. Bone is shattered, ribs cracked into jagged splinters by a bite that could crush rock, but there are pockets of flesh in hard-to-reach places, and the small hunter knows exactly where to look. Here, competition and cooperation blur. When the T-Rex is present, these lesser hunters melt into the brush, waiting for the thunder of its steps to fade. When the giant moves on, they flood back, cleaning the bones, turning wasted energy into survival. It is niche partitioning written in tooth and claw. Different sizes, different prey, different hours, a living treaty that keeps direct conflict rare on this warm Cretaceous Earth. Yet today, something is off. The troodontids are restless, changing perches more often, pausing to stare at a sky they cannot understand. Bird flocks gather in dense, uneasy clusters, then fall silent all at once, as if listening for a sound that has not yet arrived. Even the dromaeosaurs hesitate over their meal, feathers lifting in a faint breeze that carries no clear scent. Breathe out slowly and let the day soften for a moment. Imagine this forest without the Tyrannosaurus at all, ruled only by these smaller hunters, their quick minds and agile bodies shaping a quieter, more furtive Hell Creek. It would shape how energy moves through this place, how fear is distributed, how the story of this valley unfolds. Over the long arc of geological time, we ask what happens when an impact far away begins to touch even these shadows under the ferns, when the first invisible waves from a forming crater ripple through the calm and teach every nervous system here that something enormous is on the way. Those first invisible waves reach the valley long before any light or sound, and our tyrant feels them in the only language this world has ever truly trusted: scent. Before there is fire on the horizon, before there is thunder from the sky, there is a faint disturbance in the air, and a predator whose life depends on smell cannot help but notice. Tyrannosaurus rex carries its nose high, the broad muzzle sweeping slowly from side to side, enormous nasal passages opening into brain tissue that, for its size, is almost extravagantly devoted to odour. In the skull, just behind the eyes, sit the enlarged olfactory bulbs, two swollen knots of neural tissue that process scent the way a visual animal processes light, turning chemical traces into a detailed, three-dimensional map. For a creature that may weigh 8 tons, this is its finest, most delicate instrument. We now ask what it means to move through a world where every breath is information. Each exhale from a hadrosaur herd, each smear of dung on a tree trunk, each patch of drying blood in the grasslands adds another line to a script written in molecules. Territory is not only marked by footprints and roars, it is etched into the air itself. Boundaries drawn where one tyrannosaur's musk fades and another's begins. As midday heat settles over the floodplain, the sounds of the morning hunt soften, and our T-Rex slows. It halts beside a stand of conifers, chest rising and falling, and lifts its head into a thin breeze flowing down from the higher, drier uplands. Soften your shoulders with it. In that inhalation are layers upon layers of history. The iron tang of old blood from a carcass stripped 2 days ago, the sour, grassy odour of herbivore dung still warm in shaded mud, the sharp, oily hint of ankylosaur hide where one passed hours earlier, dragging its armoured tail through ferns. Threaded through all of this, there is something more intimate, a faint, familiar musk, heavy and dusty, betraying another tyrannosaur that crossed this slope in the night. Not close, not immediate, but recent enough that our predator pauses, tasting the air through a secondary passage in the roof of its mouth, letting the scent roll across sensitive tissues before deciding whether the presence was rival, mate, or both. This is about a kingdom whose borders are invisible to the eye yet obvious to the nose. Far above, winds that have travelled hundreds of miles carry different messages. On their edge rides the dry bite of high-altitude ozone, sharper than usual, braided with a whisper of mineral dust that does not quite match the local rock. The concentration is low, almost nothing, yet the consequences would echo forward if we could follow it back to its source. Our T-Rex cannot name these molecules, cannot imagine a distant impact or forming crater, only a vague unease at a new note in a familiar chord. What does a changed wind mean to an animal that has never known global catastrophe? And how will that question be answered in the hours to come? The answer, for now, is heat. By late morning, the Cretaceous sun stands high over the floodplain, and the world flattens under its glare. The distant tree line wavers, trunks and crowns melting into shimmering bands as hot air ripples upward from wet mud and drying pools. Insects rise to meet it, a soft, constant buzzing that fills the gaps between the slower sounds of this place. The creak of reeds, the distant bellow of hadrosaurs, the slow pulse of water curling through abandoned channels. Sound behaves differently in this brightness. It presses close to the ground, damped by the rising thermal haze, so that even the footfalls of a 7-ton predator seem muffled at a distance. Our Tyrannosaurus moves more slowly now, each step measured. The earlier hunting energy bled away into the thickening heat. In a world without artificial shade, without concrete or glass, the only refuge from the midday impact of the sun is vegetation and water, and the dinosaurs know this in their bones. Large bodies hold warmth. They gain it easily and surrender it reluctantly, and a creature as massive as this T-Rex walks a narrow line between power and overheating. To manage that balance, it relies on the same physics that shape your own day, radiating excess heat through the skin, venting it through the moist surfaces of the mouth and throat, slowing its pace when the air itself feels heavy. Its jaws open slightly as it climbs a low rise, tongue glistening, shallow panting, pulling air across rich networks of blood vessels and air sacs that thread through bone and muscle. At the top of the rise it pauses. Here, a lone conifer throws a ragged pool of shade over compacted ground, its roots gripping a patch of higher, drier rock above the swampy flats. This is the vantage point, a place where breeze can reach the skin, where scent carries, where vibrations in the ground announce movement long before eyes confirm it. Our T-Rex folds down with surprising care, hind limbs tucking, tail sweeping into a counterweight, ribs expanding and relaxing as it settles into a half-resting crouch. The head lowers but does not fully sink to the earth. One eye slits against the glare, the other angled toward the floodplain below. Muscles along the neck loosen, heavy jaws sagging a fraction, yet deep within the chest the heart continues its steady work, each beat sending slow waves through a body designed to endure long, hungry years. This traces conservation, not of dramatic chase, of waiting, not striking. You can join that waiting. Let your breath slow and settle in for a moment. Imagine the rhythm inside this animal. In, out, in, out. A long exhale, steaming faintly in the hot air. Then another pause. Let's borrow that tempo, letting your own breathing fall into the same unhurried pattern, each cycle a tide moving through a warm, quiet sea. Around the resting giant, the floodplain drifts into its own midday trance. Dragonflies patrol the slick surfaces of oxbow ponds, their wings catching hard points of light. A distant triceratops herd stands knee-deep in water, motion reduced to the occasional flick of a tail or slow turn of a frilled head. Even the smaller predators retreat to thickets and burrows, their movements compressed into shadow and stillness. Across millions of years, the fever of morning has become a suspended moment in the long afternoon. We'll ask what it means for such a powerful animal to surrender to this pause. Every sense stays open, nostrils sampling the layered odours of resin, mud and distant flesh, inner ears attuned to the faintest tremor, skin feeling the gradient between sun and shade. Yet behaviour narrows to almost nothing. Energy is banked, not spent, because on this day, on this earth, the real impact has not yet come. Under the high sun, with the sky still clear and blue, there is no visible crater, no ash, no fire. There is only heat and a resting tyrant, and a question hanging over the bright humming air about how long this quiet can last. In the glare of the high sun, the quiet is not empty at all. It is threaded with whispers that never touch the air, a hidden conversation carried through sand and clay and buried roots, moving in slow waves beneath the resting tyrant's feet. Large bodies have always listened to the ground. On our modern Earth, elephants feel distant thunder through the soft pads of their feet, reading low rumbles that travel farther than any shouted call, while crocodilians sense tiny ripples and impacts through their armoured skulls, their whole skeleton acting as an antenna for vibration. Dinosaurs shared this world of silent messages. Hollow bones, broad feet and dense ligaments would have turned their bodies into receivers for the deep, low-frequency tremors that most smaller animals never notice. Our T-Rex lies half in shade, half in light, ribs rising and falling in a slow, economical rhythm, and the soil beneath her is alive with these signals. A herd of hadrosaurs 2 valleys away sends a faint rolling pulse with every synchronized footfall, a pattern her body has known for years. A distant stand of conifers sheds an old giant in a storm-weakened gust. The trunk hits the ground with a muffled thud that arrives first as a shiver in the earth, then, much later, as a dull sound in the air. Farther still, a river undercuts its own banks, collapsing mud and gravel in slow motion, each slump adding another barely their tremor to the endless background hum. To her this is weather, seismic weather, the ordinary impact of a living landscape rearranging itself. She does not have to be awake to feel it. Even in drowsy half-sleep, the filigree of vibrations flows up through the soft tissue of her feet, through ankle and shin, into the massive columns of her leg bones and the deep cradle of her pelvis. This follows her territory written in motion and pressure, updated with every step and fall. But today, within that familiar tapestry, something else begins to appear. At first, it is not a jolt or a jarring shock. It is a slow, almost imperceptible swell beneath the noise, a background tremor so broad and low that it blurs into the rhythm of her heartbeat. It is not local. It does not match her catalogue of herds, falling trees, collapsing banks. We ask you to soften your shoulders here and drift here for a while for a moment, because what is arriving is not a predator, not a storm, not even a distant volcanic roar. Far beyond the horizon, a rock the size of a city is sliding down its final spiral toward impact, dragging tidal waves of stress through the planet's crust long before it carves its crater. Birds in the canopy pause, feathers fluffed, as if responding to a change in pressure they cannot name. Small mammals in their burrows fidget and resettle. The tyrant stirs, one eyelid lifting, sensing something. We now leave the question hanging. Can an animal so attuned to the language of footsteps and distant movement feel the first faint echo of a rock still hours away from striking the earth, an event that, over the long arc of geological time, would change everything? The tyrant's eyelid lifts the rest of the way, not for a rock still far beyond the sky, but for something much closer. On the faint breeze that slides over the floodplain, another signal arrives, layered over the warm scent of mud and fern and distant hadrosaur herds. It is the smell of another king. High above the sandbar, The T-Rex rises to its full height, vertebrae locking, tail angling out as a counterweight, ribs expanding with a slow, deliberate breath. Nostrils flare, drawing in the air in long, sampling pulls, sorting molecules of odour the way you might sort memories. There, beneath the resin of conifers and the damp sweetness of rotting leaves, is the heavy, oily musk of another adult tyrannosaur, moving along the hazy edge of its range. The day is nearing its hot, shimmering peak. Heat wavers over the open bars of the river, turning distance into a mirage, smearing outlines into bands of quivering light. Through that distortion, a silhouette appears. Deep chest, massive skull carried low, the slow pendulum swing of a tail. Two apex predators, separated by a few hundred feet of baked sediment and whispering grass. Territory for these dinosaurs is not a clean line scratched on a map. It is a gradient of presence and pressure, built from scent marks, shed skin, dung piles, and the remembered locations of carcasses and waterholes. Ranges overlap, especially around resource hotspots where herds cross the river or where the forest opens into rich grazing flats. To own everything would be to waste energy on endless patrols and fights. To own enough is to survive. The resident male stiffens his posture, lifting his head until his profile cuts against the pale sky. This concerns a conversation without words. A low rumble starts deep in his chest, more vibration than sound, rolling out across the flats, through the bellies of small mammals, through the hollow bones of nearby birds. It is not yet a challenge. It is an announcement. I am here. I am large. I am not afraid. The intruder answers. A matching bass note, slightly different in timbre, trembles through the heated air. Both animals angle their bodies to be seen at their broadest. Necks arched, jaws parted just enough to show the architecture of teeth that can crush bone with the force of tens of thousands of newtons. They stamp once or twice, sending puffs of dust into the light, a slow-motion display of mass and confidence. Let's ask, why do they hesitate when each bite could drive rivals away from carcasses and nesting grounds? The answer is written in their scars. Every healed rib, every gouge in the jaw, carries the memory of how expensive combat can be. A broken leg is a death sentence. A shattered hip means starvation on the margin of another's kingdom. So they weigh the cost and benefit in a language of glances and angles. The intruder edges along the boundary, keeping one eye on the river corridor where prey trails converge, one eye on the resident's stance. He does not advance straight on. He drifts, oblique, testing how far he can press without triggering the charge that would turn this tense stillness into violence. Minutes pass. The sun climbs, heat building on scales and feathered fringes, insects spiraling in the thick air. Breathe out slowly and step out of the day for a moment. Imagine standing between them, feeling the low thunder of their calls in your chest, knowing that in all the long history of Earth, very few confrontations carry this much concentrated energy. At last, the intruder eases his head a fraction lower, his body rotating so that his massive skull no longer points directly at the resident. A sideways step, a concession, but not a surrender. The local male answers in kind, holding his ground yet letting his tail drift, shoulders relaxing by degrees. The message is clear. This hotspot is watched, but there is room, on the fringes, for a passing hunter who knows when to yield. Without a blow exchanged, the standoff resolves. Two tyrants, each over 7 tons of muscle and bone, turn away bearing only invisible marks, their nervous systems branded with fresh calculations about risk and reward. Decisions like this, repeated over years, shape who lives long enough to breed, who controls carcasses, who leaves descendants to patrol these floodplains. But overhead, the sky's no longer entirely ordinary. High, thin clouds carry dust from distant fires. Far beyond sight, a different kind of impact is already inbound. In deep time, negotiations over territory will stop mattering, and this quiet, successful act of avoidance will be remembered by no one at all. Beneath the heavy, three-toed feet of this Tyrannosaurus, the ground is not just mud and roots and scattered bone. It is a stack of buried worlds. Each step presses down on feet of quiet history. Old river channels choked with sand, silt from forgotten floods, and the dark, compressed ghosts of forests that fell long before this predator ever hatched. Soften your shoulders and let the day soften. We'll follow that pressure downward, as if vision could sink through the rock. Just a few feet below, the clean sands of an ancient channel hold the frozen curve of a meander, a river that wandered across this same floodplain hundreds of thousands of years ago, then shifted, abandoned, and left its bed to be entombed. Pebbles still remember the tug of vanished currents. Tiny shells rest where the water slowed and dropped its load. Beneath that, a smear of fine clay records a broad, lazy flood that spread silty water across a forest floor, drowning ferns and low shrubs in a slow, suffocating blanket. Their leaves, once glossy and green in the Cretaceous sun, are now only thin films of carbon, pressed flat, stacked in sheets, a library of veins and stems that no eye will read. Deeper still, there are buried forests standing where they grew, trunks toppled by storms, root mats locked in place, pollen grains packed into the gaps between them. Each layer is a moment, a season, a climate held in suspension. This is about wet years and dry ones, of warmer intervals when subtropical plants crept north, and cooler pulses when the canopy thinned and open patches spread beneath a paler sky. In these sediments, Earth has already rehearsed endings. There are thin bands where charcoal spikes marking years when fires raged more fiercely, perhaps after a lightning storm during a drought. There are subtle shifts in the types of pollen and the chemistry of the clay, quiet signatures of climate swinging, of rivers changing course, of ecosystems blinking out in one place and blooming in another. Not the single, shattering impact to come, but many smaller trials of extinction and renewal. If we now ask what it means for a world to end, we must admit that this landscape has ended many times before. Imagine the bones already sealed in the dark below, duck-billed dinosaurs that once called from these floodplains, horned giants that locked frills and horns in ancient battles, crocodile-like reptiles that lurked in side channels, waiting for unwary prey. Their skeletons lie stacked in different horizons, a quiet audience beneath the living drama, listening with stone ears to the footsteps above. Our T-Rex walks over them without knowing. Its weight sends a dull tremor through layers that remember other hunts, other deaths, other brief dominions. Over the long arc of geological time, its own ribs and teeth, its massive skull and tail will join them, folded into a new stratum laid down by ash and flood and time. And one day, long after the crater is filled and the fires have gone out, some future mind may stand where it stands now, reading these layers, asking what story we once told at the surface while our bones were being written into the rock. For the moment, though, the story is still at the surface. Afternoon leans toward evening over the floodplain, and the light begins to change in a way that does not match the hour. Shadows reach a little farther than they should, stretching from conifer trunks and hadrosaur backs as if the sun has slipped a fraction lower in the sky. Colours sharpen. Greens of cycads and ferns take on a thin metallic edge, and the mud along the riverbank gleams with an almost polished sheen, as if each grain of sand has been turned to a tiny mirror. Our Tyrannosaurus stands within this brightening dimness, its hide mottled by bands of light that feel unfamiliar on its skin. It knows this world. For 20 years it has watched the sun swing over these low horizons, through wet seasons and dry, through the long, heavy summers of a greenhouse Earth. But today, across millions of years, there is a faint misalignment, a tilt in the way the sky pours down its energy. High above the wrecks, beyond the drifting pollen and the slow spirals of insects, the upper air is being written on by something it cannot see. Thin streaks form at the edge of vision, pale wisps scratched across the blue in long straight paths that refuse to curl and fray like ordinary clouds. They hang there, almost motionless, as if some invisible claw has raked the stratosphere and left it smouldering. Those streaks are the first visible breath of the incoming rock, far out over the curve of the Earth, plunging through thinning air at many miles a second. At that speed, air cannot move aside quickly enough. It is squeezed, compressed, and in compression it heats, glowing faintly, then fiercely, long before impact. We ask you to imagine the air itself as a fluid being forced through a narrowing channel, its molecules jostling so violently that they burn, passing their heat into the layers above the clouds. The result is subtle, but living things feel it before they understand it. Let your breath slow and settle in for a moment. In the canopy, small feathered dinosaurs fall abruptly silent, their contact calls clipped off mid-note. A flock of toothed birds lifts as one from a sandbar, wheeling without the usual lazy spirals, wings beating hard toward distant oxbow lakes. Above the river, pterosaurs that had been surfing gentle thermals buckle and shear away, their flight paths jagged, as if the invisible ladders of rising air they rely on have splintered. Near the Rex's feet, a mammal no larger than your hand pauses at the mouth of its burrow, whiskers testing a pressure it cannot name, then vanishes underground. This traces an atmosphere being disturbed from the top down. As the asteroid drills closer, it drags bow waves of compressed air ahead of it, ripples that alter wind patterns and temperature gradients long before any crater is carved. To the Rex, these are only hints. A gust that arrives from the wrong direction, a faint shimmer at the horizon, the restless motion of wings where there should be calm. For a moment it lifts its massive head, golden eyes narrowing, staring up at a sky it has seen 1,000,000 times before, unaware that this familiar canvas is about to ignite. For a long suspended heartbeat, predator and sky regard one another, the Rex's gaze fixed on that familiar blue vault that, in deep time, will blaze with impossible light. Then the wind shifts, carrying something older and more urgent than any distant impact. The warm, damp scent of hadrosaurs, a moving river of plant-eaters flowing toward water. Downwind, beyond a screen of conifers and broad-leafed understory, a herd is on the move, their low calls overlapping in a soft resonant chorus, feet thudding in the half-dry mud of a late-season channel. It is late afternoon on this Cretaceous floodplain, the air still heavy with heat, but already the angle of the sun is softening, turning dust motes into slow-falling sparks. Hunger has been building in the Rex all day, a quiet ache beneath the ribs, and now opportunity slides into alignment with need, as it has done for millions of years on this stretch of Earth. The hunter lowers its head and begins to move. This follows strategy, not just force. It angles away from the open bar of the river, using low rises of ancient sand and the broken silhouettes of fallen logs to erase its outline. Every footstep is placed with care, 7 tons of muscle and bone distributed over broad, cushioned feet that press into the soil with surprising silence. The wind is in its favour, flowing from the herd to the predator, carrying the musk of hadrosaur skin, the crushed fern tang of their breath. To your eyes, from some safe, impossible vantage point, the scene would feel almost peaceful. The hadrosaurs graze and murmur, juveniles weaving through the pillars of adult legs, tails sweeping arcs in the dust. Dragonflies stitch the air above shallow pools. A turtle slides from a sun-warmed rock. You can let your breath slow and drift here for a while, as let's follow one more hunt in a world that believes it will last forever. Closer now. The Rex keeps the tree line between its body and the herd slipping from shadow to shadow, pausing whenever a head lifts or an ear twitches, Its vision is sharp, tuned to motion and contrast. Its hearing catches the uneven rhythm of a limping animal near the rear of the group. We now ask, in a world on the edge of extinction, what matters more than this one limping hadrosaur, this single chance to eat before nightfall? When the distance closes to a few dozen feet, the pattern changes. The Rex rises a little higher, chest expanding, tail lifting for balance. For a heartbeat, everything holds. Then the energy that has been coiled in muscle and tendon releases. The charge is not a mad sprint, but a controlled, accelerating thunder, each step a deep percussive impact that sends tremors through the ground. Birds explode from the trees. The hadrosaur's low calls snap into alarm. The chosen target stumbles in the churned mud near the water's edge, tries to turn, slips. There is no need for gore here, only motion and sound, a rush of dark mass crossing sunlit ground. The sharp exhale of the predator as it swings its skull forward. The heavy final thud as bone meets bone, as that colossal bite closes with enough force to crush, to end. Then stillness, broken only by the hiss of the river and the fading echoes of fleeing feet. In the deep time of dinosaurs, this scene is utterly ordinary. Repeated across continents and millions of years, a simple transaction of life and death. Yet we, watching from the far end of history, know that this particular afternoon hunt unfolds just hours before an impact in distant seas will carve a crater and send fire around the world. It would reshape the world, but here, for now, the Rex feeds in quiet satisfaction, unaware that this routine success is framed by the last calm daylight its species will ever see. For a while, the world narrows to teeth, tendon, and the slow rhythm of feeding. Our Tyrannosaur stands ankle-deep in the churned mud of the water's edge. The hadrosaur's body splayed where it fell, skin split, ribs opened, warm organs spilling toward the shallows. Each bite is deliberate, powered by a jaw that can crack bone as easily as rotted wood, peeling back layers of flesh that have only just stopped moving. Around this focused violence, the rest of the floodplain holds its breath. Then, almost imperceptibly, the circle widens. At the tree line, slim shapes pause, then edge closer, yellow eyes catching the last clean daylight. Dromaeosaurs, feathered and low, pace in a broken ring, far enough to avoid a sudden charge, close enough to smell blood and wet intestine. They wait for the moment when the Rex lifts its head, when those massive jaws are busy rearranging a mouthful of meat and not policing the shadows. Between the dromaeosaurs, smaller hunters thread their way forward. Troodontids, with quick, nervous steps and oversized brains for their time, test the boundary of danger one feathered toe at a time. One darts in when the tyrannosaur shifts its stance, seizing a strip of dangling muscle, then skitters back, heart hammering in a chest the size of your hand. You can almost imagine its calculation, the balance between calories gained and the impact of a single, misplaced step under that crushing foot. In the shallows, the water itself seems to move. Broad, plated backs and ridged tails slide closer, only the eyes and the narrow ridge of a snout breaking the surface. Crocodilians, some no longer than a human arm, others long enough to rival the dromaeosaurs, wait for drifting scraps. A severed forelimb bumps against a log. Jaws rise, close with a soft, decisive crack, and the limb is gone. Energy transferred from one dinosaur's death into another lineage's survival. Above it all, the air fills with wings. Primitive birds and small toothed flyers wheel and settle, hopping along the carcass's far side, plucking at torn skin, at parasites shaken loose, at clots that the big predator ignores. This concerns a communal feast, not in the human sense of sharing, but in the ecological sense that nothing here belongs to one body for long. Flesh becomes muscle, heat, motion. Bone, shattered by the tyrannosaur's bite, will splinter into fragments small enough for crocodiles to swallow, for insects to burrow into, for fungi to lace with invisible threads. Even dung will not be wasted. When the Rex finally pauses to void the heavy meal already in its gut, that steaming pile will be colonized in hours, feeding beetles, fly larvae, and in time plants whose roots tap the enriched mud. Let's ask, as we watch this scene, how much of death on this earth ever truly ends, and how much simply changes address over the long arc of geological time. Yet as the feast unfolds, something subtle shifts overhead. The afternoon should be long and bright, but the light dims a little faster than the angle of the sun can explain. High above, barely noticed by eyes fixed on blood and movement, a faint haze begins to veil the sky, turning its blue to a thin metallic milk. Breathe out slowly and step out of the day for a moment, and you can feel the unease in this Cretaceous air, a tension the animals cannot name. One by one, heads lift. The Tyrannosaur freezes mid-chew, strings of red hanging from its teeth. Dromaeosaurs go still, tails held rigid. In the distance, beyond the trees, the upper atmosphere brightens with a brief, uncanny flash. Too far to hear, too distant to understand, but impossible for any watching eye to ignore. For a moment, let us step away from Hell Creek, from the frozen Tyrannosaur and the brightening sky, and move outward. Soften your shoulders and imagine that time itself pauses, every wing beat and footfall suspended, while far beyond the blue, another scene is unfolding in perfect, indifferent silence. Out in the dark between worlds, the asteroid is nothing special. It is a lump of ancient rock and metal, perhaps 6 miles across, the size of a city, turning slowly in the vacuum, its surface baked and cracked by eons of unfiltered sunlight and deep cold. For millions of years it has wandered, nudged by the faint pull of distant planets, following a path carved by gravity and chance, with no intention, no destination, no awareness that its trajectory is about to intersect a living Earth. We'll ask what that really means. At tens of miles per second, this rock is moving faster than a rifle bullet, so swiftly that it could cross the distance from horizon to horizon in less than the time it takes you to blink. Its kinetic energy is beyond ordinary imagination. The impact will release more power than billions of nuclear weapons detonated together, enough to gouge a crater more than 60 miles wide, to shake the crust of the planet, to redraw the history of life across millions of years. Yet from the asteroid's point of view, nothing changes. There is no roar in space, no blaze of entry, only the silent swelling of a blue and white disk ahead, growing larger with each passing heartbeat of orbital mechanics. Clouds and continents turn beneath, utterly unaware. This is about a collision written long before any dinosaurs walked, now finally coming due. As the rock meets the upper atmosphere, the quiet ends. Air cannot move out of the way fast enough. It is compressed into a white-hot sheath around the descending mass, heating to thousands of degrees in an instant. To an observer on some impossible platform above the world, the asteroid becomes a growing fireball, brighter than the sun, trailing incandescent vapor as it punches downward, drilling through layers of sky in a matter of seconds. Shockwaves pile up ahead of it, invisible walls of compressed air that will soon race around the globe. The surrounding atmosphere rings and flexes, transmitting the impact's future violence faster than any sound you have ever heard. Everything afterward would be different, yet on the ground, for a brief moment longer, the world remains almost calm. We return to Hell Creek. The Tyrannosaur's eyes are still fixed on that uncanny brightness, pupils narrowed, chest rising and falling. Around it, hadrosaurs shuffle uneasily, and distant pterosaurs wheel, their silhouettes sharp against a sky that is still mostly blue. Then, faint and low, a rumble arrives, like distant thunder from a storm that no one can see, rolling across the floodplain, tying the unseen fireball overhead to the last ordinary breaths of this dinosaur's day. And above that quiet growl, the light continues to grow. The light continues to grow, and with it, the behavior of the living world begins to fray at the edges. At first it is small things. the kind of unease that would usually pass with the next gust of wind. A flock of enantiornithine birds roosting in the canopy erupt all at once into the air, leave spinning in the wake of their wings as they scatter without a visible predator. On the ground, small mammals that have been foraging at the forest margin freeze, whiskers trembling, then bolt in a coordinated rush toward the dark safety of burrows and root tangles, vanishing beneath the surface of the floodplain as if pulled by an invisible tide. High above, pterosaurs that have been riding gentle thermals begin to veer and yaw, their long wings twitching in subtle corrections that become less subtle with each passing heartbeat. They bank hard, then harder, as if the sky itself has developed unseen currents, as if some deep infrasonic pressure is pushing at their hollow bones. Their crests tilt and sway, catching signals that the eye cannot see. Many of these animals are exquisitely tuned to change. They live and die by tiny shifts in barometric pressure that herald storms, by faint infrasound that rolls ahead of distant thunderheads, by electromagnetic murmurs that whisper through Earth's atmosphere when lightning discharges far away. They do not understand these forces in any conscious way, but their nervous systems have been sculpted by millions of years of selection to treat certain patterns as danger, to fire muscles before minds can name the threat. Today, those patterns are breaking. The pressure is dropping in a way that does not match any known storm. The low-frequency roar that has begun to seep across the continent is deeper and more continuous than thunder, a long unbroken note of energy that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Across millions of years, the reliable rules their bodies trust are beginning to fail. Our Tyrannosaurus, still standing over the cooling hadrosaur carcass, feels it as a tremor in the air against the sensitive openings of her ears, as a faint vibration in the ground beneath her clawed feet. She pauses mid-feed. Bone fragments fall from her jaws. Her great skull lifts, eyes narrowing, nostrils flaring to taste a wind that smells of dust and ozone, but not of rain. This is not the approach of a familiar Hell Creek storm front, sweeping in from the western interior seaway. This sound is lower, stranger, a continuous approaching growl from a rock that has not yet touched the ground. Let your breath slow, and imagine standing beside her as the world itself seems to hum. This traces instinct running ahead of comprehension, of bodies that know only that something vast is wrong. We ask how it feels when every fibre is sounding an alarm for a world that has no escape route, when even the mightiest predator finds no clear direction to run. For a moment the entire floodplain seems to hesitate, predator and prey alike holding their breath under a sky that has begun to glow along one distant edge. The glow along the horizon swells, sharpening from a vague unease into a line of white fire, as if a second sun is trying to claw its way through the atmosphere in the wrong part of the sky. It is late afternoon in Hell Creek, the real sun already angling toward evening, and yet the world is about to experience a false dawn that will not bring morning. The light arrives first. It must. It crosses the gulf from the impact faster than any sound, faster than any shockwave racing through rock and mantle, giving this floodplain a fraction of a moment to witness its own undoing. In deep time, the gentle gold of the Cretaceous day is erased, replaced by a searing actinic brilliance that washes over the river channels and fern beds. Shadows snap into existence, knife-edged and alien. Every tree trunk, every hadrosaur, every armoured ankylosaur throws a silhouette so sharp it looks carved, pinned to the ground by impossible radiance. Colours drain from the scene. Greens and browns bleach toward a stark monochrome, as if someone has drawn a curtain across the familiar palette of this ecosystem and replaced it with pure contrast. Our Tyrannosaurus rex is caught in that glare. Her pupils, already narrowed for the fading day, contract to pinpoints, black slivers in amber eyes. For an instant she freezes, head raised, nostrils flaring not at a scent this time but at the sheer wrongness of the sky. Then instinct takes over. The massive skull twists away from the source of the light, neck muscles bunching, jaw opening on a raw, involuntary roar. It is not the confident bellow of a ruler advertising her presence. It is a startled, ragged sound torn from deep in the throat, the sound a 7-ton predator makes when the rules of the world change without warning. Around her, smaller dinosaurs explode into motion. Flocks of bird-like maniraptorans lift as one, beating frantic wings, colliding in mid-air because they cannot see. Their eyes are overwhelmed, their retinas flooded. You can imagine standing there beside her, feeling the heat on your skin, seeing nothing but white and the black geometry of those impossible shadows. Breathe out slowly and let the day soften for a moment, until there is only this floodplain, this tyrannosaur, this impossible second daylight that should not exist. Then, as quickly as it rose, the flash begins to ebb. The brightness collapses back toward ordinary sunlight, then below it, leaving the landscape in an eerie, premature twilight. After images cling to every gaze, ghostly outlines of trees, of horns, of open jaws, burned into retinas so that when eyes move, the world seems to smear and double. This follows a world that has just been briefly erased and redrawn. The T-Rex blinks, shakes her head, snorts, but the phantom shapes remain, drifting across her vision. In that dim, hushed interval, before the air itself remembers what has happened and begins to move, we'll ask what follows a flash that bright, and what it would feel like when the light is gone and the true consequences of the impact finally start to arrive. The answer arrives first as sound. Far to the south, beyond any horizon this animal has ever known, the impact has slammed into the young crust of Earth and carved a crater in the shallow sea, and now its energy is being translated into air, into a hemispheric shockwave that begins to race outward faster than any storm that has ever crossed this world. It is not weather. It is a wall. At Hell Creek, the silence after the flash deepens into a low, almost inaudible pressure in the chest, a suggestion that the world is holding its breath. Then the air begins to speak, a murmur, a rumble, a deepening roar that seems to come from everywhere at once, from the sky, from the ground, from the hollow spaces in bone. Our T-Rex lifts her head, jaws parted, tongue tasting heat and dust on the rising wind. This concerns a wave in air, but it behaves more like a moving cliff. Ahead of it, the atmosphere is squeezed, compressed into a thin, invisible blade that drives sound to deafening intensity long before the front truly arrives. The forest responds first in whispers, leaves flipping, fronds bending, seed heads shivering on their stalks. Then the trunks begin to creak. The hot wind climbs from a breeze to a steady push, then to a shove that will not be ignored. She feels it in her tendons before she understands it. Instinct, refined over millions of years of storms and seasonal floods, tells her to brace. She plants her columnar legs wider, claws digging into the damp floodplain, tail dropped low as a counterweight, body turned slightly so that her profile is narrower to the oncoming force. For a heartbeat, it works. She's a 7-ton anchor in a world beginning to move. Then the shockwave arrives. Sound and pressure hit together, a concussive blow that collapses the distinction between hearing and touch. The roar is no longer something in the ears. It is inside the skull, inside the chest, a hammer made of air. Trees bow as if in instantaneous submission. Some snap, shearing with sharp gunshot cracks. Others are uprooted, flung sideways in arcs of soil and roots. Branches, cones, torn ferns, and shattered bark become shrapnel. Soften your shoulders and imagine standing beside her as the front edge of that wall of compressed air passes through. For a moment there is no clear boundary between wind and ground motion. The surface of the floodplain ripples, water in side channels piles up and slaps outward, and the T-Rex is driven a half step, then a full step sideways, one massive foot skidding, tail whipping to regain balance. Smaller dinosaurs are not so fortunate. A juvenile hadrosaur is tumbled past her feet, legs bicycling in empty air, while a cloud of insects, leaves and dust erases the familiar contours of the forest. Over the long arc of geological time, the landscape is shredded and rearranged. The canopy that shaped the sounds and shadows of her entire life is torn open, replaced by a chaos of ragged silhouettes and flying debris. She bellows, but the call is ripped from her throat and scattered, indistinguishable from the scream of the wind. Vision blurs. The phantom afterimages of the flash are now overlaid with real ghosts of motion, trunks twisting, boulders rolling, nests and branches spinning through the air. Then, as abruptly as it began, the leading edge passes. The wind slackens from impossible to merely violent, then to a heavy rushing gale. In its wake, there is a strange ringing silence inside the ears, a numbness where sound should be. The T-Rex stands half-crouched, flanks heaving, a forelimb scraped, one leg trembling as she forces herself upright amid toppled trees and choking dust, in a world that no longer looks quite the same. For a moment, the world holds its breath. The shockwave has passed. The roaring edge of air has spent its fury, and in the strange ringing hush that follows, it almost feels as though the danger has moved on. It has not. Above this shattered floodplain, high over the broken crowns of conifers and the crouched, trembling shape of our T-Rex, a second act is beginning. When the asteroid struck, it did more than carve a crater into young crust. It hurled Earth itself into the sky. Rock, water, and vaporized minerals were launched on towering arcs, some thrown clear of the atmosphere, some lofted halfway to space before gravity called them home. As these fragments rose, they spread into a vast incandescent veil, then began to cool, to condense, to crystallize into glassy droplets and jagged grains. Now, in deep time, they are falling back, across continents. If you could stand safely behind glass, far above this scene, you would see the upper atmosphere turning to a slow, shimmering river. Tiny points of light trace long, graceful paths, each one a grain of returning rock, superheated by the air it plows through. At first, it is almost beautiful, a world-spanning meteor shower, a glittering aurora of stone. We now ask, if you did not know what it meant, would you simply watch in awe? Down here there is no distance, no safety. The first embers begin as a faint patter on fallen branches and exposed skin, a soft hiss as they land in puddles left by the earlier surge of air. Little beads of glass, still orange at the core, bounce and roll into the angles of bark and leaf. Then the rain thickens. What was a delicate sparkle becomes burning hail. Each glowing grain carries the stolen energy of the impact. When it comes to rest on a dry fern frond, the tissue curls, blackens, then blooms into a thin tongue of flame. On resin-rich conifer needles, the effect is faster, the pitch flashing, the fire racing along branches in seconds. A hadrosaur flank, already scraped and bleeding, spasms as embers sting exposed flesh, leaving tiny, smoking pits. Spotfires multiply in every direction. One on a log, one in a mat of dead needles, one in a clump of reeds along the river's edge. They seem separate, manageable. Then the wind freshens and each small flame leans, stretches and finds its neighbours. Lines of fire merge into walls, and the forest canopy, already shattered by the earlier blast, becomes a lattice of torches. Our T-Rex lifts her head, nostrils flaring. Smoke has a direction, and she follows it backward, away from its densest black towers, toward the low gleam of water. This is about instinct meeting an event far outside any evolutionary rehearsal. She moves with a painful three-legged stride, away from the thickest tangles of fuel skirting toppled trunks that smoulder at their cores, seeking the open, the wet, the places where fire hesitates. Let's follow her as she wades toward a shallow channel, as embers hiss and die against her dampened flanks, while all around the air itself turns against the living world and the night comes early, lit from below by the rising sea of flame. For a moment, there is the illusion of escape. Our Tyrannosaurus steps out of the choking understory and onto the bare ribs of the river, a broad sandbar and gravel braid where the last flood has scoured away most of the fuel. Here, the ground is pale, open, and wet in places, and the flames that hunted her through the trees hesitate at the water's edge, flickering and retreating before the cooler air rising from the channel. Behind her, Hell Creek burns in layers. Individual fire fronts, born from falling embers and sheets of re-entering glassy rock, have grown teeth and direction, feeding on resinous conifers and tangled understory, racing along fallen logs that act as natural fuses. Each front throws up its own column of smoke, a towering boiling stem of ash and vapour that punches upward, then bends, then merges with its neighbours into a single, roiling canopy. Seen from above, if we could imagine ourselves drifting high over this world, the effect would be unsettling. Plumes that began as local accidents now knit together into one vast moving continent of smoke, stretching from horizon to horizon, its underside lit in pulses of orange and white where new crowns of trees ignite. This traces a regional disaster learning how to become something more. On the sandbar, the T-Rex lowers her head and stands almost motionless, chest heaving, sides slick with a film of mud and condensed sweat. The air here feels marginally safer, but it is changing. Heat from the fires and from the incandescent rain of ejecta still returning from the upper atmosphere is trapped beneath the growing smoke ceiling, turning the floodplain into a low, sprawling furnace. Temperatures can climb higher than the hottest summer day, even as the sun itself begins to vanish. The light dims in a strange, uneven way. It does not slide gently toward evening. It stutters and bruises, turning yellow, then copper, then a deep internal red. Shadows sharpen, then fade. The sun is still technically above the horizon, but its disk is now a dull coin behind the thickening pool, its energy scattered away by soot and dust climbing toward the stratosphere. Let your breath slow and settle in for a moment. We'll stand beside her in that heat, in that half-day. The roar of burning forests is a distant, continuous surf, overlaid with the crack of collapsing trunks and the hiss of superheated sap. Ash falls in slow spirals settling on her muzzle, collecting in the hollows of her footprints, turning the wet sand a mottled grey. Across millions of years, the balance of light and heat has inverted. It is hotter, yet darker. A faint breeze brushes along the channel, cool compared to the furnace inland, carrying the higher, thinner smoke of particles that have already climbed far above weather, where they will spread around the planet and dim the world for years. We ask what it means for a night to last not hours but seasons. Around the sandbar, new fire fronts flare along distant banks, their glow smeared and muted by the low ceiling of ash, so that the horizons burn while the sky directly overhead deepens toward an unnatural charcoal. Our T-Rex stands in that eerie half-light, framed by orange at the edges of the world, while above her, noon has already begun to look like a starless waiting night. And then, as that false noon deepens toward charcoal, the day begins to lean toward evening. The sun lowers behind the distant conifer crowns, and the Hell Creek floodplain stretches out in long cooling shadows. Heat that pressed down all afternoon begins to lift, letting a faint breeze slide across the sandbar, across the glassy backwaters and slow, brown channels that wind between stands of fern and magnolia. This is the hour when colours soften and edges blur, when the world of our T-Rex usually settles into a familiar dusk routine. Tonight something small changes first in the water. On the surface of a still oxbow pool, between floating mats of duckweed and the drifting pollen of ancient flowers, a point of light appears reflected from far beyond the trees. It is steady, not flickering like fire, not rippling like the broken image of the sun. A single, bright pin, low in the mirrored sky, where no star should yet exist. Far beyond the horizon, above the curve of the Earth, a rock the size of a city has entered the upper atmosphere. It is moving faster than any bullet, tens of thousands of miles per hour, ploughing into air so hard and so suddenly that the air itself cannot get out of the way. Compressed, heated, stripped of its calm, that air flares white and blue around the descending body, pouring energy into the asteroid's surface until it glows, then boils, then sheds molten droplets that trail behind as an invisible storm. Down on the floodplain, no one sees that storm. They see only the light. On the far bank, hadrosaurs stand hip-deep in water, their broad muzzles combing through aquatic plants. In the angled rays of late afternoon, their eyes already catch a warm orange from the sinking sun. Now a second, colder glint appears on the black enamel of those eyes, a tiny, unmoving highlight that does not track with the usual path of day. Leaves pick it up as well. Waxy magnolia surfaces, the lacquered scales along our T. Rex's muzzle, the curve of a small predator's claw in the undergrowth, each gain a faint, unfamiliar edge. Shadows still point toward the west, but this new brightness hangs low in the south, fixed, indifferent to the turning of the sky. Our T-Rex lifts her head and pauses. Her vision is sharp, tuned to movement, to the flick of tail or wing. Yet even she notices that one point that does not move. It is too early for the evening star, too low for the moon, too pure in colour to be reflected fire. It simply burns, unwavering, as the air high above her turns to plasma around a descending mountain. From her perspective, there is no impact yet, no crater, no extinction. There is only a strange, steady brightness that does not fit into her long, practiced history of afternoons. We now ask, in a moment, what this scene would be if that were all, if this light passed on, missing Earth by a whisper, leaving the dinosaurs to write another 66 million years of story. For now, breathe out slowly, and drift here for a while, because this follows the last truly ordinary light she will ever see. The camera comes in close, to a single, golden eye. In its glossy surface, forest, river, and that distant unnatural star all hang together, frozen for one suspended heartbeat, over the long arc of geological time. Just before the sky begins to change, the suspended heartbeat releases and time begins to move again. High above Hell Creek, that unnatural star swells, the bright point blooming into a pale streak that drags a wound across the upper sky. In the space of a few slow breaths, the streak thickens, brightens, and then condenses, as if the heavens are gathering all their light into one place. The late afternoon blue drains away around it. The world tilts toward white. This concerns a second sun being born, not in the deep furnace of a stellar core, but in the thin air above a living planet, where a city-sized rock tears through the atmosphere at tens of thousands of miles per hour. Its speed is its fuel. Its motion is its fire. As it falls, the air in front of it has nowhere to go, crushed and squeezed so hard that it heats until it glows, the way a bicycle pump grows warm in your hand, multiplied by 1,000,000,000. Down in the floodplain forest, the T-Rex lifts her head higher, nostrils flaring, pupils narrowing to slits against the brilliance. Shadows around her sharpen, double, and then triple, as if the usual sun has been joined by a younger, hotter sibling crouched low on the horizon. Tree trunks cast overlapping bands of ink-black darkness. Every fern, every leaf, suddenly has two edges of shade. She tilts her skull, the massive jawline cutting across the glare, and a low, uncertain rumble vibrates through her chest. It is not a sound of understanding. It is the complaint of nerves and eyes and ancient instincts, all telling her that this pattern of light does not belong to any season written in her species' history. Around her, the whole community of dinosaurs falters. A hadrosaur knee-deep in the river stops mid-chew, water dripping from its beak as it stares toward the brightening fireball. A ring of triceratops in a distant meadow lift their heavy heads in near-perfect unison, horns and frills catching the strange radiance. Overhead, pterosaurs that were tracing easy spirals suddenly wheel and bank, their silhouettes flashing from dark to golden as the second sun climbs. For a moment, even the insects fall quiet. The constant trill and hiss that has filled this warm Cretaceous day thins to a faint, uneasy murmur, as if the smallest nervous systems on Earth are also pausing to listen. Let's slow everything down here, frame by frame. Breathe out slowly and imagine the colours washing over the landscape. The river becomes a ribbon of burning metal, mirroring the fireball so perfectly that it seems there are two of them, one in the sky, one in the water, chasing each other toward the horizon. Wet mud along the banks gleams with scattered sparks. Glossy magnolia leaves and the lacquered surfaces of cycads catch the light, turning the forest into a hall of mirrors. The asteroid is still far away, its true impact destined for a coastline far beyond any horizon these dinosaurs will ever see. But light does not care about distance. It is already here, already touching every scale and feather in Hell Creek, a silent herald arriving across the long, silent span of the rock's plunge into the upper air. We'll ask, what does it feel like to stand beneath a sky on fire and hear no sound? The answer, for now, is only brightness. The blazing orb swells, then seems to hesitate, sinking toward the curve of the Earth, and then, as if it has rolled over some invisible edge, it vanishes, slipping behind the planet's roundness, leaving behind a strange, lingering glow that paints the undersides of the clouds in molten orange, a promise of something vast just out of sight. For a heartbeat, there is nothing. The blazing orb is gone, hidden by the curve of the Earth, and Hell Creek falls into an uncanny stillness, as if the whole world has taken a breath and forgotten how to let it go. Shadows lengthen without a source. The air feels paused, expectant, as if even the insects hanging over the river are waiting for a signal that does not come. Then it arrives. An instant, white-hot, without warning. A single flash, brighter than any noon this floodplain has ever known, pours over the landscape in a continuous searing sheet. It does not ramp up or fade in. It is simply there, everywhere, at once. To the T-Rex, half-turned beneath the fringe of conifers and broad-leaved understory, the world becomes pure radiance, edges erased, colours crushed into a blinding electric white. We ask what this really is. This is not the impact shockwave, not yet, not the rush of displaced air or the rain of rock from the forming crater. This is thermal radiation, energy travelling at the speed of light, racing ahead of every physical disturbance. In deep time, it has crossed continents, delivering the heat of a second sun to every exposed surface that can drink in its brightness. Leaves respond first. On open branches, fronds stiffen, curl and darken, their surfaces blistering as the delicate tissues cook in place. Needles on conifers go from deep green to a dry, angry brown. Resin trapped in bark softens, then bubbles, clear beads swelling and popping with quiet, frantic urgency. Shallow pools along the channel steam at their edges, thin veils of vapour lifting from mud where amphibians have been resting moments before. The tyrant is not in the open, and that is the only reason it survives this first flash. Forest trunks, a low rise of packed floodplain sediment, and the angle of its own massive body throw shadows that blunt the worst of the beam. Even so, the heat on its skin is immediate and merciless, an invisible fire that does not need flame. Scales on the exposed flank tighten and dry. Muscles clench. The great predator flinches, head dropping, eyelids slamming shut, chest heaving with a sudden involuntary hiss. Out beyond that partial shelter, smaller dinosaurs have no such protection. Feathered omnivores caught on a bare sandbar feel their plumage crisp at the tips, filaments fusing into warped clumps. Some rear back, wings half spread, then crumple as pain and shock overwhelm them. Insects in mid-flight simply fall, wings scorched, tiny bodies stunned by the abrupt rise in temperature. Eyes are the most vulnerable. Pupils that had widened in the strange dusk are assaulted by brilliance, photoreceptors overwhelmed, leaving some creatures staggering, blind, in a world that has become pure glare. From inside the T-Rex's body, the event is another kind of storm. The outermost layers of tissue heat faster than the blood beneath, and we follow that wave inward. Nerves fire in chaotic patterns, broadcasting alarm. Vessels in the skin dilate, sending a rush of blood to the surface in a futile attempt to shed heat. The heart, already powerful enough to drive circulation through 7 tons of muscle and bone, hammers harder, pounding against the ribs. This is a predator built to withstand exertion, to chase and crush and tear, but it has never known an attack from the sky. Soften your shoulders and imagine the sensory confusion. The smell of scorched vegetation arrives almost at once, sharp and bitter, riding on air that shimmers above sunlit stones and drying mud. Thin threads of smoke begin to rise from patches of leaf litter, twisting lazily at first, then thickening as more organic matter crosses the threshold into char. This is about a forest beginning to burn before a single flame has had time to travel, ignited by light alone. For a few long seconds it feels endless. Then, as suddenly as it came, the radiance ebbs. The white glare collapses back into colour. The world does not return to normal. It settles into a stranger, dimmer version of itself. The sky is hazed, the horizon smeared with incandescent clouds. In the T-Rex's vision, after-images drift and dance, ghostly shapes that refuse to vanish, as if the memory of that impossible brightness has been burned into its eyes. The silence does not last. Far away, something heavier is coming. The heavier thing is invisible at first. In the strange half-light after the flash, the world hangs in suspension. The glare has faded, but the sky is still wrong. A low, bruised glow along the distant horizon, and high above, a faint widening ring where vapour and dust have been punched into the upper air. It is as if some unseen hand has drawn a circle across the roof of Earth, and the clouds are only beginning to understand what has happened. For a few long heartbeats, sound has not caught up. Light arrived almost instantly. Pressure and noise must make the journey the slow way. The floodplain is momentarily quiet, apart from crackling leaves and the dry hiss of needles as the first small fires begin to lick at resin-rich branches and fern beds. A charred cone drops from a conifer and rolls smoking into the dark water of a side channel. Far away, beyond any horizon this T-Rex will ever see, the rock has already done its work. In shallow tropical seas, an asteroid the size of a city has slammed into carbonate platforms with unimaginable energy, excavating a crater more than 100 miles across, heaving the crust, vaporizing ocean and stone. Over the long arc of geological time, a colossal pressure wave has been stamped into the atmosphere and sent racing outward, a circular bruise on the skin of the world. Here the Tyrannosaur stands utterly still, 7 tons of muscle and bone frozen. Its flanks heave, pulling the altered air deep into bird-like lungs. Its nostrils flare at new scents that do not belong to any ordinary afternoon. Burned resin, scorched fern, the sharp metallic tang of ozone, mingled with a fine, choking dust that was not present an hour ago. This traces a predator whose greatest sense is smell, and the invisible landscape of odour around it has shifted in ways it cannot name. We now slow down and imagine the air itself. Not empty, but dense and elastic, a medium that can carry a bruise. Ahead of the coming roar, molecules are already crowding, compressing, forming a moving front that travels faster than any storm wind, flattening and lifting as it goes. The consequences would echo forward it touches, not by flame at first, but by force. Subtle precursors arrive before the main blow. A low, distant roar, at first no more than a murmur under the crackle of fire, grows from the far horizon, not in the sky alone, but in the bones of the ground. A faint tremor shivers through buried roots and buried eggs. Hadrosaurs on a distant bar of sand bunch shoulder to shoulder, tails rigid, some bolting blindly into the shallows. Smaller predators abandon half-finished hunts and vanish into burrows, root tangles, and deep thickets where light already looks like evening. Let's ask what this looks like from far above. The camera of your imagination can rise, leaving Hell Creek behind, watching an invisible wall of compressed air cross oceans and continents, racing over warm Cretaceous seas, over conifer forests and fern prairies, over herds of titanosaurs and flocks of pterosaurs spiraling upward in confused panicked loops. Let your breath slow and step out of the day for a moment. Follow that rippling ring as it curves along the surface of Earth, closing the distance to our Tyrannosaur with every passing second. Back on the floodplain, the wind begins to misbehave. It comes from the wrong direction, then drops, then returns, stronger, with a rising, unnatural steadiness. A single leaf, half burned at the edges, dangles from a low branch above the T-Rex's massive skull. It trembles once, twice, then lifts against gravity, held there by a force that is still gathering. The true edge of the shockwave is almost here. The leaf does not fall, it snaps sideways. The first hard gust arrives not as a breeze, but as a shove, a sudden muscular blow of air that hits the forest from the east, bending every trunk, every fern, every needle and frond in the same direction, as if an invisible hand has swept across this corner of Hell Creek. For a heartbeat it holds there, branches bowed, grasses streaming, then the pressure flicks and everything whips back the other way. Sound follows a moment behind. Not a crack of thunder, not a single strike, but a rolling, continuous roar, deeper than any storm these dinosaurs have ever known. It fills the sky and the ground at once, a low, unbroken growl that vibrates through soil and bone, humming in the hollow spaces of the T-Rex's bird-like lungs, trembling in the chest of every animal that can still hear. The tyrant braces, massive feet spread, claws bite into the soft floodplain mud. Its tail swings out and down in a practiced counterbalance, the living cantilever that has kept it upright through charges, turns, and bone-crushing impacts with prey. Now it leans into the wind as branches snap around it, as splinters, cones, and strips of bark are torn free and hurled through the air, pinging off thick scales, snagging in the dark feathering that rims its neck and spine. This is a shockwave. On a calm night, air is thin and elastic, letting sounds and scents drift. Here, that same air has been hammered by the energy of the impact, squeezed into a steep, moving wall of pressure at the front, followed by churning, chaotic winds behind. It is the atmosphere behaving more like water, a fast-breaking surf that can flatten forests, topple weaker rock, and tear apart anything that cannot bend or anchor itself in time. The forest answers with a chorus of breaking wood. Some trees, already undermined by years of floods, twist, lift and topple, roots tearing from the ground in slow, reluctant spirals. Others keep their trunks but lose their crowns, branches stripped clean so abruptly that the canopy opens in ragged wounds. The understory is pressed flat in sheets, ferns and horsetails pinned to the soil as if under a giant palm, then ripped loose and carried downwind in streaming ribbons of green, trailing spores and shredded leaves like smoke. Grit stings the T-Rex's eyes, It half closes them, nictitating membranes sweeping across to shield the delicate surface, but fine sand still finds its way in. It tastes the change as much as it sees it. Dust, ash, crushed resin from shattered conifers, a bitter tang that coats the tongue and drowns the familiar musk of hadrosaurs and ceratopsians. Around it, the cries of other animals are reduced to thin, torn fragments, duck-billed bellows and mammal chirps chopped into pieces by the roar, until they are only hints of sound, swallowed almost as soon as they form. We'll ask you, just for a moment, to step inside this moving wall of air. Breathe out slowly and imagine the pressure changing around your ears and lungs, a heavy hand pressing in on your chest, then easing, then pressing again in long, slow pulses. The world blurs at the edges, not from speed, but from the sheer density of what is passing by. Needles, bark, insect, soil, and water droplets all suspended in the rushing wind. At Hell Creek's distance from the crater, it is devastating, but not yet the end. For a 7-ton predator, this is punishment, not instant extinction. The T-Rex is shoved sideways, forced to take a staggering step, then another, one foot skidding in the slick mud as a sapling whips across its flank hard enough to bruise. It coughs, shakes its head, roars once in reflex, the sound torn away and folded into the larger thunder, but its spine holds, its ribs flex, and it survives the first onslaught. Gradually, the wind begins to unclench. Gusts come farther apart, the great roar thinning into a hoarse, uneven howl that threads through the broken trunks. In the settling silence, the damage becomes legible. Branches lie heaped in tangled drifts. Tree crowns rest on their sides, leaves still green, but already wilting. Stunned animals creep from burrows and thickets, eyes wide, movements cautious, as if the air itself might strike again. On the horizon, where the sky should be a clear late Cretaceous blue, new shapes are rising. Dark, smeared plumes climb above the trees, columns of distant smoke that twist and billow upward, hinting at fires kindling along the path of the wave. This follows a world that has been struck but not yet finished, a world holding its breath between the first blow and what comes next. The roar of the shockwave drifts away over the horizon, leaving Hell Creek in an uneasy hush, a silence filled with ringing ears and trembling branches. For a few long heartbeats, the only sounds are the creak of settling trees and the distant crash of disrupted rivers finding their banks again. Then, from far above, a new sound begins, faint at first, almost gentle. It is a patter, a scattered, irregular tapping, as if heavy rain were beginning to fall on leaves and water, on armoured backs and feathered hides. The T-Rex lifts its head, nostrils flaring, one golden eye turning toward the sky that only minutes ago flashed brighter than the sun. What it hears is familiar in rhythm but wrong in tone, harder, sharper, a rain that does not quite ring true. Because this is not water. The first impacts in the mud beside its feet are tiny glowing fragments, grains and pebbles of rock and glass that hiss when they strike a puddle, sending up little bursts of steam. Each piece is ejecta, torn from the crust at the moment of impact, blasted high above Earth, out past the thin blue shell of air, then spreading around the planet before falling back again. We linger for a moment in that vast, invisible arc. The impact has turned part of the Yucatan into a fountain of molten rock, droplets and shards hurled thousands of miles, their paths bending in the planet's gravity well. As they re-enter, they plough through the atmosphere at enormous speed, compressing the air in front of them, heating it until whole layers of sky glow, a planet-wide broiler suspended over forests and seas. To eyes on the ground, it becomes a spectacle. Streaks of light race across the darkening heavens, a meteor shower multiplied 1,000-fold, every trail a brief searing line. It would reshape the world. Each spark is a potential ignition point, a seed of fire falling into a world already shaken and stunned. Around the T-Rex, the rain of embers thickens. Pebbles strike broad fern fronds and bounce away. Still red at the core, they land in leaf litter and smoulder, tiny coals nestled among last year's decay. A dry tuft of Cretaceous grass catches. At first it is only a faint orange glow, then a small, flickering flame that leans and straightens with each breath of wind. This concerns fire being born in 1,000 small gestures. A single ember comes to rest on a fallen log, its bark split and resin-rich. For a moment there is only a thin thread of smoke, curling upward in a lazy spiral. Then the heat finds its path inward, sap blisters and pops, and a tongue of flame unfurls, tasting the air, catching on a low branch, then another. Animals react before they understand. A hadrosaur herd, already unsettled by the shockwave, shuffles and calls, some individuals stepping toward the strange new lights, others backing away, snorting, their flanks shivering. Smaller dinosaurs, feathered predators with bright eyes, dart to the edges of the glow and then retreat, confused by the moving shadows. In the undergrowth, mammals pour from burrows and hollow logs, their high-pitched alarms threading through the deeper bellows and honks. On a global scale, in deep time, this same process may be unfolding on every forested continent, turning vast tracts of woodland into a patchwork of flame and smoke. We now ask what it means for a world when the night itself begins to burn, but for now we stay close to Hell Creek's growing ring of fires, watching as separate sparks find one another and merge. The T-Rex stands at the edge of a shallow slough, chest heaving, skin speckled with cooling glass. Ahead, a nearby tree crown shudders as embers lodge among its needles and fronds. For a breathless pause, nothing happens. Then the canopy flowers into orange, a blooming torch that roars upward, painting the trunks below in dancing light. The glow reflects in the predator's wide eyes as the first true firestorm begins to take shape around it, a new, relentless force entering the story of its final day. The torch in the canopy does not stay alone for long. Around Hell Creek, scattered tongues of fire born from falling embers and shattered trees begin to find one another, their separate flickers merging into jagged rings that creep along the forest floor and then, with sudden bursts of energy, leap forward through the undergrowth. Fire here runs low and fast at first, a living line racing through dry ferns and coarse Cretaceous grasses, turning green to black in a heartbeat, feeding on years of shed needles and brittle twigs. It climbs fallen logs like ramps, racing along their resin-rich hearts, then reaches upward on dead branches and leaning trunks, laddering into the crowns of conifers and broad-leaved understory trees until whole sections of forest stand wrapped in roaring light. Within this shifting maze, the T-Rex moves. It is too large to hide, too massive to be nimble, yet its size is a kind of armour against the tangle. Where smaller dinosaurs must weave and dart, it simply lowers its skull and shoulders, driving through weakened branches that snap against its hide, shoving aside half-burned trunks that would pin a lighter animal in place. Each step is a negotiation between instinct and obstruction, between the urge to flee and the limits of a body built for power, not for tight turns. Sound presses in from every side, the crackle of burning wood, the groan and crash of collapsing trees, the hiss where sap boils and bursts from bark, all blend into a constant consuming roar. Ash swirls in dense, spiralling curtains, turning the air into a grey river that flows past the Tyrannosaur's teeth and into its lungs. One flank burns with radiant heat from a nearby wall of flame. The other feels cooler, washed by smoke-thick air drawn in from unburned forest, a reminder that not every path is yet closed. Wildfire is not new to this world. For millions of years, lightning and falling rock have set forests alight, and the dinosaurs of Hell Creek carry an old, inherited memory of flame. Move away from the brightest, hottest, loudest places. Seek open ground, seek water. But the scale and simultaneity of these fires, born from an impact that shook an entire hemisphere, are unprecedented over the long arc of geological time. There is no concept of extinction in the Tyrannosaur's brain. There is only a flood of signals, pain from scorched skin, searing heat along its sides, the bitter taste of smoke, and the relentless command to keep moving. Around it, other giants struggle through the same catastrophe. Hadrosaurs churn through shallow channels, stampeding into water that steams at the edges, their calls hoarse above the fire's roar. Ceratopsians bunch into tight horned clusters, circling calves while embers drift down on their frills. Smaller theropods skim the margins of the fireline, darting along half-burned game trails, vanishing and reappearing between curtains of smoke. Amid the chaos, there are moments of eerie beauty. Embers rise on columns of hot air and drift outward, slow and deliberate, like fireflies cast against a sky already dimming with distant dust from the crater far to the south. Silhouettes of fleeing dinosaurs flicker against curtains of orange flame, each shape a brief, living shadow in the long history of Earth. Let's ask you to soften your shoulders and let the day soften for a moment, to simply follow the king as it pushes on. At last, through smoke and falling ash, the forest breaks. The T-Rex steps onto a muddy riverbank, the ground soft, low and marshy, where the fire's advance falters at the water's edge. For a moment there is space, and the flames hold back. But new threats are already gathering here, in the thickened air above the river, and in the darkening currents that slide past its feet. The river should be a refuge, a ribbon of cooler air and open water where the flames hesitate, where life can pause and take stock. But as the T-Rex stands ankle-deep in the slow brown current, the safety here is already thinning, dissolving into a haze that turns the late daylight a muted coppery grey. Across the channel, the fire is distant now, a ragged orange line buried behind trees, yet the air over the wetland thickens with what it throws ahead of itself, smoke that tastes of resin and sap, fine ash that drifts down in lazy spirals, microscopic grains of glassy dust lofted by the impact's unimaginable energy. Distant forest becomes only suggestion, a smudged silhouette where trunks and crowns once had edges. The sun is still above the horizon, but it is no longer bright. It is a dull, red disk, its glare filtered through miles of suspended particles. The T-Rex draws a breath, deep, powerful, filling the great bellows of its bird-like lungs and the air sacs threaded through its bones. This is about efficient respiration that once gave the dinosaurs their edge, turning every inhalation into a precise exchange of oxygen for motion, for hunting, for the long patrols of a 7-ton predator. Now, with each breath, oxygen arrives mixed with soot, with charred plant fragments the size of dust motes, with invisible shards of silicate condensed from vaporized rock. We'll slow down and move inward for a moment, past teeth and tongue, into the dark corridors of the throat. Here, the air is warm and wet, lined with delicate surfaces that must stay clear if the animal is to keep moving. Ash settles on the moist walls, clinging, caking, turning them from slick to gritty. Farther in, at the branching passages of the lungs, particles land on thin membranes where blood and air meet, where every heartbeat depends on open space. The body responds in the only ways it can. Muscles around the airway tighten. Reflexes fire. The T-Rex's chest heaves in a short, explosive exhalation that is not quite a cough, but rhymes with one. A harsh, rattling sound that sends a puff of grey dust from its nostrils. Another breath follows, but it is laboured, a little slower, the exchange less complete. For an animal that evolved to move, to chase, to defend territory over many miles. Even this small reduction in oxygen is a quiet crisis. Around it, the wetland adjusts in its own, more frantic ways. Some hadrosaurs push toward the lowest ground, nostrils close to the water, where the air is marginally clearer, cooled and filtered as it slides across the river's surface. Small mammals and lizards cling to the mud at the base of reeds, pressing into burrow mouths where the smoke is thinner. Overhead, pterosaurs and birds beat upward, trying to climb through the densest layers, gambling that the air is better above the haze, accepting the risk of stronger winds and flying embers. Visibility shrinks by the minute. Trees that were clear shapes an hour ago are now only dark columns fading into a wall of grey. Nearby, a triceratops becomes a moving shadow, its horns and frill reduced to shifting angles in the gloom. The sun hangs lower, red deepening toward wine, its light so diffuse that it casts almost no shadows at all. You can settle in for a moment and imagine standing there, watching distance itself vanish. At the T-Rex's feet, ash settles on the river in a steady, silent fall. It forms thin grey films that spread and fracture, breaking into islands and streaks that swirl around its toes as it wades. Each step sends ripples outward, curling the ash into delicate spirals before the current pulls them downstream, toward other bends, other lowlands, other lungs. Far beyond Hell Creek, beyond this single river, the same smoke and dust are rising into the upper atmosphere. Across millions of years, winds will carry them around the world, wrapping Earth in a veil that will dim sunlight and cool the surface, turning this local disaster into something approaching global night. We ask what that darkness will mean, but not yet. For now, the T-Rex lifts its head. Nostrils flare, drawing in the changing sky. Above, there is no blue left at all, only a deepening bruised colour, as if the day itself is being pressed closed, one slow breath at a time. By the clock of this Cretaceous day, it is only early evening. The sun should be lingering low over the floodplain, drawing long warm shadows from the trunks of conifers and the broad leaves of flowering trees. Instead, the light is vanishing as if someone were turning a dial, each moment a notch darker than the last, each breath a step further from ordinary dusk. Overhead, the sky thickens. Dust, soot, and aerosols lifted by the impact climb and spread. A high, dirty veil that swallows colour and scatters what remains of the sunlight into a dim, directionless glow. There is no clear source now, no bright disk behind the haze, only a bruised, uniform ceiling. In deep time, day is reduced to something closer to a storm twilight, then to something deeper still. The animals feel it first as confusion. Diurnal birds, the small feathered dinosaurs of these forests, begin their roosting calls far too early, voices rising in anxious waves from the canopy. Herds of hadrosaurs along the riverbank start to bunch and settle, their usual evening choreography thrown off by the abrupt loss of light. In the undergrowth, mammals and small nocturnal hunters stir before their time, blinking wide pupils into a world that is not yet night, but no longer day. For the T-Rex, there is an edge here. Its eyes are large, forward-facing, tuned for low, slanting light at the margins of dawn and dusk. This traces a predator built to operate in half-shadow, reading depth and motion where other dinosaurs see only flat silhouettes. Yet even those eyes falter as the contrast drains away, as trees and hills collapse into a single dark mass, as prey and rival merge into a few uncertain shapes on the horizon. On a global scale, this is the opening of an impact winter. Sunlight is being blocked. Soon, temperatures at the surface will begin to fall, and photosynthesis across continents will be throttled. The energy budget of the entire Earth is shifting quietly, implacably. Everything afterward would be different if it lasted. We now ask you now to step into this dimming world. Soften your shoulders and imagine standing in a landscape you know well as the light is slowly turned down. Colours fade to greys and blues, edges soften, and in compensation, every sound sharpens. The drip of water, the crack of a branch, the distant rush of a river. The T-Rex responds in much the same way. As the false night descends, it moves more cautiously between the trees, each heavy step placed with care on the soft, ash-dusted ground. Vision becomes only one thread in a wider sensory net. Nostrils flare, drawing in the thick, smoky air, sorting the familiar musk of hadrosaurs and ceratopsians from the harsher scent of burned resin and scorched fern. It pauses often, head tilted, listening for the low murmur of a herd, the wing beat of a pterosaur, or some new unfamiliar rhythm in the darkened forest. Along the river, the transformation is almost theatrical. Fire glows flicker in the middle distance where the earlier blast ignited stands of dry vegetation. Their light now dulled and reddened by the haze, embers drifting down the banks like slow falling stars. On the ground, scattered coals gleam in the underbrush, tiny constellations at the feet of towering trunks. Above them, the true stars are gone, hidden behind the dust-filled sky. The heavens are a blank, smothered dome. Let's drift here for a while, for a moment longer, and stay with this first falling night. The heat from the fires still licks at the air, but as the T-Rex stands by the dark water, a new sensation slips through the smoke. The first cold breeze, thin and tentative, brushing its feathers and skin. It is only a hint for now, a quiet promise that the furnace of the day will not last, and that something colder, deeper is already on its way. Now, the promise becomes a presence. Only hours ago, Hell Creek baked under a heavy, humid heat, the floodplain steaming as if the whole world were a low, green furnace. Now, under a sky turned to ash by vaporized rock and soot, a thin chill begins to seep into the air, threading between tree trunks, sliding along the blackened surface of the river, touching skin and feather and leaf in turn. The change is quiet, but it would reshape the world. With the sun smothered, the balance of energy on this part of Earth has shifted. Normally light pours down all day, warming soil and water, filling the air with heat that lingers long after sunset. Tonight, that light is gone, scattered and absorbed by dust lofted high above the clouds, while the ground still radiates its stored warmth away into space. The surface layer of the atmosphere cools first, a shallow, invisible lake of colder air slowly deepening as the hours pass. Our Tyrannosaurus feels it before it understands it, in the only way a body can understand. Muscles that spent the day flushed with heat and exertion now draw tight. A subtle shiver ripples along its torso, through the downy filaments that fringe its neck and tail. Its pace slows. Each step along the riverbank becomes more deliberate, claws pressing into damp, cooling mud that no longer steams. It angles its bulk to the wind, seeking the partial shelter of an eroded hollow where fallen logs and a low-cut bank break the breeze. Large animals carry their own weather for a while. Their mass gives them thermal inertia, a resistance to rapid change, so this 7-ton predator cools more slowly than the small dinosaurs that scatter from its path. But prolonged darkness is patient, and we now ask what happens when the night does not end tomorrow, or the day after, when the crater's dust keeps the sun at arm's length for weeks. We'll move between scales for a moment. Up close, the T-Rex exhales, and for the first time since the impact, its breath steams faintly in the cooling air, each cloud a brief ghostly flower that blooms and vanishes. Far above, the entire circulation of the atmosphere is beginning to adjust, as temperature gradients flatten, winds shift, and the great rivers of air that circle the planet start to meander and stall under their new muted source of heat. All around, other survivors improvise against the coming cold. Smaller feathered dinosaurs fluff their plumage, trapping thin layers of air against their skin as they huddle in thickets and under low, scorched branches. Crocodilians slip from ashen banks into the river, sinking into water that still holds the memory of the day's warmth, their bodies becoming dark, patient shapes beneath the surface. Tiny mammals retreat into burrows and hollow logs, vanishing into pockets of insulated earth where the temperature changes more slowly than the sky. The soundscape of this new night has shifted. Insects that once called in endless, pulsing waves fall mostly silent, their songs thinned to scattered, uncertain notes. In their place comes more rustling, the soft scrabble of claws and feet as animals seek shelter, the muffled thud of something large moving through undergrowth. Far off, the distant crackle of fire still rises, but now it competes with the low, continuous sigh of wind moving through a cooler, denser air. For now this is only the first touch of the impact winter, the leading edge of a much deeper cold that lies in the days, weeks and months ahead. This follows a world that does not yet know how long the shadow will last. Our T-Rex lowers itself at last into a guarded resting position in the hollow, legs folded, head raised, one eye turned toward the darkened river. It does not sleep in peace. It rests in exhausted vigilance, chest lifting and falling, breath still faintly steaming as the night grows longer and the world around it continues degree by quiet degree to dim and cool. Let your breath slow and step out of the day, because across millions of years, even this uneasy warmth will feel distant. The hours stretch, and at last the great body stirs again, dragged upward from its uneasy half-sleep by something older than fear, older than memory. For millions of years, for uncounted generations of tyrannosaurs before this one, the cool of night has been a time of movement and of opportunity, when large prey settles, when the world quiets just enough for a patient hunter to listen. So it rises, joints protesting, muscles heavy with ash and fatigue, and steps once more toward the river margin. But this night is wrong. The darkness is not the gentle, familiar curtain of a Cretaceous evening. It is a deeper absence, a ceiling of soot that swallows starlight and scatters the last embers of day. Vision, already challenged, becomes almost useless beyond a few body lengths. The T-Rex leans instead on the senses that have always guided it through uncertainty. The wide, air-filled passages of its skull tasting the air, the enlarged olfactory bulbs passing layers of scent, the keen inner ear catching distant cracks and splashes, the low rumble of movement through brush. Along the river and the forest edge, the pattern of life has fractured. Herds of hadrosaurs that would normally travel as coherent, murmuring bands are scattered into small jittery clusters, some animals limping, others standing rigid and silent, conserving energy in patches of surviving undergrowth. Ceratopsians, usually confident in dense formations of horn and frill, now huddle in awkward knots among toppled trunks and half-burned ferns, their trails erased by sliding ash and falling branches. We ask what it means to be a hunter when the rules of the environment change in deep time. Paths beaten into the floodplain over years of migration have vanished beneath grey drifts. Familiar scent markers are drowned in the thick, acrid veil from distant fires. Waterholes that once mirrored the sky are choked with floating bark, dead fish, and the fine dust of pulverized rock from the impact crater far to the south. The map in the predator's mind no longer matches the ground beneath its feet. Yet hunger is simple. Hunger is clear. The T-Rex angles its massive head, drawing in a long, deliberate breath through its nostrils, and there, beneath the smoke and the resin of burned conifers, is a thin metallic thread. Blood. Not fresh, but not yet cold. It moves toward it with a measured, almost cautious gait, each step sending a soft shudder through the ash. The world narrows to gradients of smell and faint sound, the distant crackle of a dying fire, the whisper of a small animal fleeing under leaf litter, the wet, irregular exhalation of something large and injured. At the edge of a shallow backwater, where the river has deposited a tangle of branches and carcasses, the T-Rex finds the source. A hadrosaur, or perhaps a juvenile ceratopsian, thrown by the earlier blast wave, lies half submerged, flank torn open, hind limbs twisted at unnatural angles. It is still alive, but only just, lungs working in slow, bubbling gasps. The encounter unfolds in muffled, smoky darkness, without the usual chorus of alarm calls or the drumming retreat of hooves. There is no chase, only approach and decision. In the very short term, this broken landscape offers a grim abundance. Fires and falling debris have done what predators and scavengers usually must invest great energy to achieve. They have created carcasses, torn limbs, and wounded animals scattered across the floodplain. For a few days, perhaps for a week, meat will be easier to find than at any point in this animal's adult life. But even as it closes its jaws around the hadrosaur's neck, crushing bone with a force that can turn skeletons into splinters, the first hints of a deeper scarcity are already present. Ferns along the bank droop, their fronds dusted and dim, starved of light. The canopy, once a dense engine of growth, is tattered and scorched. Herbivores that have escaped injury move listlessly, feeding half-heartedly on low-quality, ash-coated leaves, their reserves beginning to dwindle. This concerns a king still performing its role as if the world were unchanged. Muscles in the neck and torso bunch and release in slow, powerful waves as it braces one clawed foot on the carcass and heaves, tearing away great slabs of flesh. Each bite is deliberate, economical, shaped by years of practice and by an anatomy tuned to extract every calorie from bone and tendon. In the distance, beyond the river bend, a line of fires gutter and fade, their orange glow reduced to a sullen smear behind the smoke. Against that dim, restless light, the silhouette of the feeding tyrannosaur rises and falls, head and jaws working in a patient rhythm. We now step back for a moment and let the day soften so you can simply imagine the quiet. Because as the T-Rex pauses mid-meal, lifting its massive skull, strings of blood and water falling back to the carcass, the forest does something unfamiliar. It does almost nothing at all. The usual low thunder of hadrosaur herds is missing. The distant conversational calls of other dinosaurs are thin and sporadic. Even the insect drone is muted, many wings stilled by cold ash and sudden darkness. The predator stands listening, chest rising and falling, yellowed teeth bare to the night air, as if the whole world around it is drawn in one long breath and is holding it, waiting to see what this new, altered Earth will do next. The breath the world is holding does not break. It stretches on into the deepest part of the night, until even midnight feels pale, suspended under a sky that never truly goes dark and never truly brightens. We rise away from the Tyrannosaurus, away from the heaving chest and the blood-slick muzzle, and the scene widens over Hell Creek. This floodplain, which for millions of years has pulsed with diurnal rhythm, is now trapped in a strange, persistent twilight. The stars and the hidden moon smudged by a high ceiling of dust and soot lofted by the impact. Breathe out slowly. Let the modern world fade away. This is about an ecosystem that does not yet know it is unravelling. Plants are the silent engines of this world. On ordinary days, they turn sunlight into sugar through photosynthesis, catching photons on broad magnolia leaves, on the feathery fronds of ferns, on the narrow needles of conifers. Now that sunlight is throttled. The veil of fine rock dust and smoke scatters and absorbs the sun's energy before it can reach the canopy, so that noon is as dim as a stormy dawn, and midnight is only a little darker than noon. In response, leaves close their stomata, the tiny pores that breathe in carbon dioxide and release water vapor. It's a reflex against stress, a way to conserve moisture when light is scarce, and the air cools. Growth rings that were widening with the wet season begin to tighten. New buds hesitate. Some leaves yellow at the edges and drop early. carpeting the forest floor at the wrong time of year. Seeds and spores, waiting for warmth and clear light as their cue to awaken, remain dormant in cones, in seed banks, in the damp soil. Let's trace what that means for the animals. Herbivores in Hell Creek live on a narrow margin, their immense bodies powered by constant intake of fresh plant matter. As the days of dimness lengthen, hadrosaurs move through gallery forests more restlessly, stripping what foliage they can still find, rasping their dental batteries over twigs and half-formed leaves that would once have been ignored. Ceratopsians turn to bark, gnawing at trunks, levering up shrubs with their beaks, digging for roots where the buried energy of previous seasons is stored. Small ornithischians raid seed caches left by earlier foraging, pry apart conifer cones, and comb the litter for any nutritious fragment. For a brief interval, scavengers and opportunists flourish. The impact has already sent shock waves through this landscape, toppling trees, drowning low-lying animals, and leaving carcasses scattered among the channels. Small theropods pick at exposed ribs, slipping between larger predators. Mammals emerge from burrows and crevices, their sensitive whiskers brushing over cooling flesh, their teeth adapted to crack insect carapaces and gnaw tendon. Carrion-feeding insects bloom in sudden numbers, laying eggs in wounds, turning dead muscle into a writhing resource. It feels, at first, like abundance. The consequences would echo forward, if it could last. But this pulse of easy food is a mirage, a feast at the beginning of a famine. Over the long arc of geological time, the underlying reality asserts itself. Every carcass is a withdrawal from a bank that is no longer being replenished, because the plants at the base of the food web are slowing, stalling, failing. We'll ask what that means for a giant predator. As fern meadows thin into brown, empty patches, as groves of cycads stand strangely silent, cones unopened, the whole earth cools and darkens under its shroud. How long can an animal the size of a Tyrannosaurus endure in a world where each link in its food chain is fraying, one by one, in the half-light? But before we follow that fraying chain all the way down, let's pause it. Hold it gently in mid-air. For a moment, let your breath slow and settle in for a moment, not into darkness and ash, but into a different possibility. We ask, what if the rock had been late? What if, nudged by some distant gravitational whisper, it crossed Earth's orbit a little earlier or a little later, and the impact never came, the crater never opened in the young seafloor of Yucatan, and Hell Creek was left to its own, slower rhythms of change? In that other late afternoon, the sky above our Tyrannosaurus is innocent. No fireball, no flash brighter than the sun. Only high, thin clouds glowing peach and gold. The low angle of light catching the ripples on a looping river channel, turning the water into bands of copper and shadow. Hadrosaurs call from the far bank, their voices carrying over the floodplain in hollow trumpet-like notes. Somewhere beyond a stand of conifers, a distant roar rolls out, the territorial bellow of another T-Rex announcing its presence to any rival within earshot. In this world, years still pass, continents still drift. The inland sea retreats and advances, sea levels rise and fall, climates warm and cool, but not over the long arc of geological time. There is no single day when 3/4 of life is pushed toward extinction. Instead, the energy of change is spread over millions of seasons, storms and droughts, and slow migrations written into the long, patient history of Earth. Dinosaurs feel that changing world in their bones and feathers. Our Tyrannosaurs' descendants might grow a little lighter or heavier, legs a touch longer for running down faster prey, skulls reshape to clamp more efficiently on the armour of ankylosaurs, or the frills of horned relatives of Triceratops. Herbivores answer in turn, evolving new horn arrangements, deeper neck shields, or bright keratin crests for display. Subtle shifts in behaviour and social structure as herds become tighter, vigilance more intense, courtship rituals more elaborate. Mammals are still here, but they remain mostly small and nocturnal, their eyes wide for the night, their lives threaded through roots and burrows and the undersides of ferns. In this alternate timeline, their grand expansion into giant grazers and clever apes is delayed, perhaps diverted entirely, held back by the continued rule of giant theropods, whose shadows still fall across the riverbanks. We now drift forward through these imagined hell creeks, channels migrating across the plain, forest reassembling into new combinations of flowering trees and ferns, cooler winds one epoch, warmer rains the next, yet always the echo of heavy three-toed footsteps, the low drum of a hunting tyrannosaur moving through the undergrowth. This traces contingency of how a few minutes in orbital timing would change everything. But it is also only a thought experiment, a gentle way to feel the weight of what did happen and what did not. Because now, as the alternate sky fades, we return to the real one, choked with dust and smoke. The imaginary river light dissolves, and we are back beside our T-Rex in the only timeline it will ever know, as night deepens and the impact winter begins to close in. The night over Hell Creek has thickened into something heavier than darkness, a lid of ash pressing down on a wounded world. The wildfires that raced through the forest in the first hours after impact have burned themselves low, so that now the trees glow from within, cracked trunks and fallen branches reduced to embers, red and orange veins pulsing softly in the gloom. Between these islands of dull volcanic light, the T-Rex moves, slower now. Every step is deliberate, the great tail held a little lower, the rhythm of its stride broken by exhaustion, and the sting of half-healed scars torn open by flying debris. Smoke hangs close to the ground, and each breath drags a mix of ash and cold air deep into its bird-like lungs, efficient but overworked, forcing a shallow pant that fogs the sooty night. This follows a body pushed past its usual limits. Hours ago, this animal could have sprinted in short bursts, 7 or 8 tons of muscle and bone surging across the floodplain. Now, it chooses a different strategy. It follows the faint, familiar smell of water, skirting toppled conifers and smouldering logs until the ground slopes gently down toward the river, where the air is marginally clearer and the heat of the fires falls away. Near a bend in the channel, it finds what passes for refuge, a shallow hollow scooped by years of seasonal floods, backed by a low-cut bank that blocks the wind, edged with damp sand and the flattened stems of burned ferns. Here, the river still moves, dark and sluggish, carrying a sheen of ash away toward a distant sea and the crater that now scars the edge of the continent. Let's linger with it here, in this pocket of relative safety. Instinct guides every choice. Deep, ancient circuits in the brainstem and forebrain are running the same programs that kept its ancestors alive for more than 100 million years. Conserve energy when prey is uncertain, keep the flanks guarded, never surrender all awareness, even in rest. It folds its legs and settles into the hollow, chest heaving, tail curved to one side so that a quick launch is always possible. The head lowers. For a moment, the heavy skull rests on the ash-dusted forelimbs, eyes half-closing, nictitating membranes sliding across to protect the drying surface. Sleep comes only in fragments, a distant crack as a fire-weakened trunk finally gives way and collapses, snaps the eyes wide again. A splash somewhere upriver, something large entering the water sends a shiver of attention through the auditory centres. Then, when nothing approaches, the muscles loosen by degrees, and the head sinks once more. Soften your shoulders and drift here for a while. In this hollow, nothing in the T-Rex's body knows the word extinction. Hormones care only about now, the ache of bruised ribs, the gnaw of an empty stomach, the growing chill as the impact winter's veil thickens overhead. Neural circuits fire in response to sound, scent, temperature, not to the abstract future. We'll ask what it feels like to drift in and out of such a narrow present. The late-night soundscape has changed, There are fewer calls, fewer wing beats. Instead, there is the dry hiss of settling ash on leaves and water, the occasional rumble of distant earth as weakened slopes slump, the soft lap of the river against the bank. Each time the T-Rex's eyes close, they stay shut a little longer. Each time they open, the world is slightly dimmer, the embers a little cooler. Across millions of years, the longest night begins to turn, not with a sunrise as we know it, but with a subtle change in the quality of the darkness, a flattening of the shadows as Earth slowly rotates, and a veiled sun climbs behind the global shroud. Overhead, the ash-thick sky grows from pitch black to a muted charcoal grey, the faintest hint that a new day is coming, one that will not resemble any day this world has seen before. Roughly 24 hours have passed since that new star first appeared in the heavens, since a rock from deep space rode a blazing line across the sky and changed the history of this world across millions of years. One full turn of Earth later, we'll begin again at what should be dawn, on the second day of the tyrant's altered life. But this dawn does not arrive in colours. It arrives as a barely perceptible lifting of the dark, a transition from ink black to a heavy, uniform grey, as if someone has smeared ash across the entire sky. There is no true sunrise, no sharp-edged shadows, only a diffuse, directionless glow leaking through the dust and soot that still hang high above the crater, spreading around the globe. Beneath this dim canopy, the T-Rex stirs. For long hours it has lain in a shallow depression among toppled trunks, ribs rising and falling more slowly than before, conserving energy. Now it pushes itself upright, movements stiff and deliberate, muscles protesting after a day spent bracing against shock waves, sprinting through falling branches and shoving aside debris. Its chest expands. The great bird-like lungs drag in air that still tastes of smoke and scorched resin, and the exhale carries a faint rasping undertone. We walk with it step by heavy step through what used to be its familiar territory. The gallery forests along the river are broken and burned, crowns snapped, ferns crushed beneath splintered limbs. Landmarks that guided it for years, a leaning conifer, a particular bend where hadrosaurs crossed, are blurred under a soft grey blanket of ash. The watercourse itself runs slower and shallower, choked with branches, charred logs, and the pale bellies of fish and small dinosaurs washed together in tangled rafts. The tyrant moves, but not with the crisp, predatory purpose of an ordinary morning in Hell Creek. Its breaths come a little faster after each incline. It pauses more often, head low, nostrils flaring, testing the air for the scent of living prey, and finding mostly the cloying sweetness of decay. This concerns a body pushed close to its limits, already beginning to ration motion, to trade speed for endurance in a world where food will soon grow scarce and the air itself will cool. Because the first catastrophes are over. The flash, the furnace winds, the immediate fires, those have passed. What remains are the long, drawn-out challenges, sunlight strangled by high-altitude dust, temperatures slipping downward day by day, plants starved of light, and with them the herbivores that fed on their energy. The tyrant's reduced interest in active hunting is not weakness. It is strategy, an ancient calculus written into muscle and bone. Let your breath slow and step out of the day for a moment. Imagine this not as a single, isolated scene, but as one thread in a planetary tapestry. Across continents, under the same ashen sky, other predators rise stiffly from their shelters, other herds pick their way through fallen forests, other forests stand silent, their leaves dim and cool. Everywhere, dawns without sunrise unfold, an unplanned experiment in resilience and chance. We now ask how long a king can endure in a kingdom where day no longer means warmth, where growth has stalled, where the rules that shaped its rise have been quietly rewritten. The T-Rex moves on into the grey, following a river that no longer sounds the same, toward a future that is narrowing with every step, and we will follow, to see how long its strength, and the world that built it, can hold. But for a moment, we let that narrowing future loosen and blur at the edges. The grey sky, the ash, the failing leaves. Let them soften, as if you're watching them through water. Breathe out slowly and let the day soften, and with it, the certainty of what actually happened. In this quiet pause, the rock that was meant to end it all misses. Not by much. Perhaps in deep time its path is nudged, its timing shifted by a fraction of an hour, and instead of striking the shallow sea and carving the Chicxulub crater into Earth's crust, it passes a little farther out, or plunges into deep ocean where its energy is swallowed and dispersed. There is still an impact, still waves and storms and regional fires, but there is no global winter, no sudden extinction that topples the great reptiles in a single terrible season. This is about the king who never lost his kingdom. In this alternate history, the Hell Creek floodplains do not empty out into silence. They breathe, they adapt, they roll forward through millions of years. Forests thicken, then thin. Warm, humid intervals wrap the world in green, then cooler phases lay frost along the river margins. The descendants of Tyrannosaurus rex track these changes, their bodies and behaviours slowly rewritten by climate and chance. Imagine the same broad valleys now braided with new channels, where hadrosaurs evolve tougher beaks for grinding emerging grasses, and horned dinosaurs grow heavier frills and thicker brow horns to compete on open ground. The giant predators follow. Some tyrannosaurs become longer-legged pursuit hunters for the widening plains, others shorten and bulk up in denser forests, their feathers deepening into insulating coats as winters bite a little harder. Through it all, the lineage holds on at the top, a dynasty of bone-crushing jaws and keen senses that has never been interrupted. Under their shadow, the mammals remain careful. They still scurry through leaf litter and branch and burrow, but every rustle is measured against the risk of a passing theropod. In this world, we now ask how bold a small, warm-blooded creature can afford to be when the day is ruled so completely by dinosaurs. Many mammals stay small, nocturnal and omnivorous, their intelligence tuned to hiding and waiting rather than reshaping landscapes. A few lineages grow larger in isolated corners, but primate-like brains, with their long childhoods and costly awareness, are slower to emerge, pressed back by the constant presence of reptilian giants. Would anything recognizably human ever appear here? Perhaps, given enough millions of years, some clever grasping mammal does rise to walk upright beneath cycads and conifers, building tools in the spaces between dinosaur territories. It would reshape the world, yet it would not erase the old powers. Cities might grow behind walls high and strong enough to turn aside a curious tyrannosaur, bridges and roads engineered with moats and sound barriers to keep the night roars at bay. Cultures might tell stories of the scaled and feathered colossi beyond their lights, revering them as living dragons, ancient spirits of a world that never yielded. And if a human-like gaze were ever to meet the deep, steady eyes of a living T-Rex on some misty floodplain that has never known true silence, who would seem more ancient, more improbable? The mammal with its tools, or the king who never fell? Now, settle in for a moment, and imagine that same misty floodplain unbroken by extinction, its line of inheritance stretching all the way to our own restless century until cities rise beside it rather than on its bones. This traces glass and steel sharing a horizon with muscle and feather, of a skyline where the impact never closed the book on the giants who ruled before us. In this alternate Earth, let's stand on a high balcony as evening settles over a coastal metropolis, its towers catching the last red light, its streets humming with quiet electric energy. Between districts of offices and apartments, wide green corridors thread through the concrete, broad as rivers, planted with ginkgo groves and marshy ponds. These are not parks, they are migration lanes, preserved since deep time, where tyrannosaurs and hadrosaurs still follow routes first worn into the mud of Hell Creek 66 million years ago. Far below, a commuter train glides along an elevated track, its windows dimmed to keep reflections from startling the animals. At a signal, the train slows, then pauses in mid-air silence as a herd of triceratops begins to cross a reinforced viaduct beneath it, their frills catching city light, their horns dulled by careful management but still impressive as ancient rock. You can almost hear the soft clatter of hooves on armoured concrete, feel the faint vibration in the rails as 20 tons of living Cretaceous history passes under the evening commute. In a different district, schoolchildren press their hands to thick observation windows that look out over a protected floodplain, where the river meanders through tall grass and conifers. Far away, framed between distant towers, a mature T-Rex moves with slow assurance, each step measured, tail balancing its massive head, feathers along its neck stirring in the wind. To them it is what lions and tigers are to us now, an apex predator held at the edge of human space, dangerous yet deeply familiar, the subject of cartoons and bedtime stories and careful, regulated field trips. In such a world, science would have grown up differently around these animals. Let's ask what paleontology becomes when the fossils are still walking. Veterinary paleobiologists would spend their careers tracking the blood chemistry of hadrosaurs, monitoring the growth rings in triceratops' horns, designing tranquilizers strong enough to calm a frightened tyrannosaur without stopping its bird-like lungs. Engineers would design dinosaur-safe infrastructure, bridges and tunnels rated not only for earthquakes, but for the focused impact of a charging ceratopsian, streetlights shielded so nocturnal theropods do not lose their ancient sense of night. Global treaties would protect these corridors the way we now protect migratory birds and whales, but with clauses written in the awareness that these giants could still kill us. There would be debates about how close cities are allowed to grow to nesting grounds, about whether it is ethical to relocate a T-Rex that has begun to hunt livestock at the edge of a suburb. It would change how we plan, how we build, how we measure risk, and yet, in a quieter way, we already live beside our own remnant titans. The awe we imagine feeling as a tyrannosaur passes a glass sky bridge is not so different from the hush that falls on a whale-watching boat when a blue whale surfaces, or the breath held in a jeep as an elephant crosses a dusty road. Our relationship with the giants that remain, whales, elephants, tigers, is a faint echo of this unrealized coexistence. A reminder that on this earth, too, we're sharing space with the last survivors of older ages. If we would build corridors and treaties for T-Rex, what does that say about the paths we are willing to carve now for the great animals still with us, whose worlds are shrinking year by year? As we follow our Hell Creek tyrant toward its final night, that unasked question lingers at the edge of the story, waiting. So we let that unasked question hang in the air for a moment, and then, very gently, the imagined corridors and treaties dissolve. The thunder of tyrannosaur footsteps fades, skyscrapers empty of their reptilian tenants, and the lights of that alternate world go dark, one by one, until there is only night and the sound of wind in leaves. When the lights rise again, they are smaller, softer, a single street lamp over a present-day park, its glow pooling on a path where no 7-ton predator will ever walk. In the branches above, something moves, not a giant hunter, but a small shape, hopping from twig to twig, head tilted, feathers catching the glow. Soften your shoulders and drift here for a moment, because we'll ask a quiet, radical question. This is not a distant cousin of the dinosaurs. This is a dinosaur alive. Its body still carries the architecture of that older world. Look at the feet. 3 forward-pointing toes gripping the bark, a 4th reduced, just as in the theropod hunters of Hell Creek. Follow the legs upward, and the line of the hip and ankle still whispers of long-tailed predators that ran down hadrosaurs on floodplains 66 million years ago. Inside its chest, Two collarbones fuse into a springy wishbone, the same basic structure that braced the shoulders of sprinting, lunging carnivores, now tuned to the rhythm of beating wings. Even the bones themselves remember. They are light, honeycombed with air spaces that connect to a system of sacs threading through the body, an echo of the bird-like lungs that once let giant dinosaurs move huge amounts of air with each breath. It would change how we see this small animal if we could watch those sacs fill and empty, moving air in a one-way flow, an efficient engine first perfected long before any human drew breath. Behaviour carries the past forward too. When a hawk circles high above a field, eyes locked on the faintest movement below, that piercing vision and head-tracking focus are built on the same sensory priorities that guided tyrannosaur eyes as they fixed on a limping triceratops. When a rooster stretches his neck and flares his feathers, calling and strutting to claim a patch of earth at dawn, we hear, if we listen closely, an echo of courtship and territorial rituals that might once have belonged to tyrants along Cretaceous rivers. Extinction, in this light, is not a clean break, not a single curtain fall. The impact that carved the Chicxulub crater ended the line of large ground-dwelling tyrannosaurs over the long arc of geological time. But another branch of their family, small, feathered, flight-capable, slipped through the fire and darkness. From that surviving thread, tens of thousands of bird species unfolded, filling forests, coasts, deserts, and cities. The King's World did not vanish. It was folded into wings and songs, waiting for us to notice. And as our Hell Creek tyrant moves toward its final night, we carry this knowledge with us back into its fading world. We carry it with us into the dark floodplains and whispering conifers of Hell Creek, the knowledge that this world will end. Our tyrant does not know, yet the rocks beneath its feet remember, and they are going to tell us their story. To follow a single day in the life of a Tyrannosaurus, we now ask the earth itself for testimony. Fossil bones give the outline, heavy leg shafts, deep ribs, a skull that is more window than wall, revealing where muscles once coiled with silent energy. Trackways press that outline into motion, long strides frozen in mud, a pause where the toes dig in, a turn toward a riverbank that has not flowed for 66 million years. Let your breath slow and step out of the day for a moment. Under a microscope, those same riverbank rocks become layered diaries. Thin bands of clay and sand stack one atop another, each flood season a page, each ash layer a timestamp from distant volcanoes. In deep time, a strange seam appears, a razor-thin line rich in iridium, an element rare in Earth's crust but common in meteorites, dusted across the planet when a mountain of rock struck the Yucatan and carved the Chicxulub crater. In that line, grains of quartz are scarred and shocked, their crystal lattices bent by pressures beyond any ordinary earthquake. Tiny glass spherules, once droplets of molten rock, are scattered through the clay. By tracing how those particles settled through air and water, how they blanket some fossils and not others, scientists can time the impact not only to a particular day, but to the unfolding hours after fire rained from the sky. This follows catastrophe written slowly, yet describing something that happened faster than a heartbeat. Inside the bones themselves, CT scanners thread through ancient marrow spaces, revealing sinuses, nerve canals, and the architecture of strength. Comparative anatomy links T-Rex skulls to those of birds and crocodiles, allowing estimates of muscle size and bite force so great it could crush bone as easily as dry twigs. Computer models test how those legs carried 7 tons across soft ground, how much meat that mass demanded each day, whether the King's routine was an all-out sprint or a patient, energy-saving patrol. From the shape of the inner ear, from the bulge of olfactory regions in the brain case, we imagine a sensory world sharp with scent and low, thunderous sound. The details are not fantasy. They're constrained by physics, by biology, by what bones can bear, and what ecosystems can feed. There is speculation here, quietly acknowledged. but it is speculation with boundaries, anchored to rock chemistry and the shared design of living bodies. As you rest with this, there is a quiet satisfaction in knowing how much can be recovered from almost nothing. And with these tools in hand, let's walk back into that final morning and watch the last day unfold hour by hour. And with these tools in hand, we'll walk back into that final morning and watch the last day unfold hour by hour. First light. Cool air over a warm swamp. Mist braided between conifers and flowering shrubs. The ground soft with years of fallen needles and mud. The tyrant rises, muscles creaking, breath steaming, and begins its slow patrol through a kingdom stitched together from scent and sound. This concerns a routine that has played out thousands of times before, beneath a sky that seems unchanging. By midday, the world is brighter, heavier with heat. Hadrosaurs churn the floodplain, Triceratops grind through low branches, and our T-Rex moves with practiced economy, testing the wind, reading the vibrations of distant footfalls. One charge, one impact, and a wounded animal falls, bone cracking under a bite whose energy can shatter rock. It feeds, as it has fed for years, at the center of a web of motion and decay and renewal that feels to every creature in it permanent. Afternoon slides toward evening. The Tyrannosaur rests in the shade, flanks rising and falling, eyes half closed, flies tracing lazy spirals in the air. Around it, the Hell Creek world hums. Insects, distant calls, the rush of a broad meandering river. Nothing announces that across millions of years, everything will be asked to change. Then, the second sun. A point on the horizon that blooms into a white noonday above noonday, brighter than anything this world has seen. The asteroid meets Earth, and far away, the tyrant only feels the message. A low, rolling shudder through the ground, a wind with the sharpness of broken worlds, the distant roar of forests igniting. Later, ash will begin to fall, a fine grey snow settling on scales and leaves and water. We'll ask gently, how much of this was inevitable? The rock that carved the crater at Chicxulub followed a path shaped by countless tiny tugs and nudges, each one insignificant on its own. Minutes earlier, minutes later, a deeper ocean, a different angle, and the same impact might have been only a regional wound. It would reshape the world, for dinosaurs, for mammals, for us. In that sense, the tyrant's last day mirrors our own lives. So much rests on invisible edges, a chance encounter, a storm that veers, a discovery made or missed. We move through our routines, certain, even as the deep machinery of the world rearranges futures we cannot see. Every dominant creature lives inside a chapter that feels like the whole book. For T-Rex, the age of dinosaurs was simply reality. 3 million years of presence on these floodplains. For us, cities and satellites and global networks feel equally permanent, yet the rocks beneath our feet remember other empires of bone and leaf, other climates, other skies. If you let the day soften for a moment and breathe out slowly, there is a quiet comfort in that. Our problems shrink against the canvas of Earth's history, yet our choices do not vanish. The living world around us is the descendant of those that survived catastrophe, a lineage that passed through fire and darkness. How we treat it, how gently we step on this old, scarred planet, becomes our small contribution to a story that will continue long after us. And as ash settles on the tyrant's world, we follow that story forward, through night and shadow, to see what endures. As night settles over Hell Creek, that story passes for a moment through the chest of a single animal. An adult Tyrannosaurus rex, 20 years of muscle and scar and memory, stands quiet in the forest's edge, then lowers its massive head and folds its body to the ground, ribs lifting and falling in a slow, tidal rhythm as the stars wheel overhead. This is about one day that will never come again. The heat of the impact, the roar of fire, the ash that will drift down in deep time have not yet arrived here. Not in this small pocket of darkness, where crickets rasp and distant hadrosaurs mutter in their sleep. For this tyrant, for this exact heart beating in the fern-scented air, the world is still whole. We ask you to remember the day that brought us here. Dawnlight on wet mud, the distant calls of triceratops across the floodplain, the rich smell of rotting wood and river silt carried on air that this predator could read like a book. Its eyes measured distance and motion. Its inner ears felt the faintest tremor. Its nose traced invisible trails through the forest, turning the landscape into a map of scent and sound. Around it, the living tapestry of Hell Creek moved and breathed, ankylosaurs grinding low plants in the undergrowth, pterosaurs drifting along the river fog, small mammals threading through roots and burrows, their entire history compressed into the shadows. All of that energy, all of that quiet competition and cooperation was balanced on a thin edge of chance, waiting for a rock from space to fall into a shallow sea and draw a line through Earth's history. The line came. The impact carved a crater, lit the sky brighter than the sun, and turned forests into furnaces. Within hours, the tyrant's day was over. Within years, almost all of its kind were gone, and the age of non-avian dinosaurs closed in fire and darkness. Yet not quite everything ended. Feathers and hollow bones, keen eyes and fast hearts slipped through the gate of extinction and took to the air as birds. So tomorrow, when you wake, you're going to walk through a world still carrying their imprint. A crow on a power line, a heron in a city pond, the small bones in a sparrow's wing are living links to that sleeping T-Rex. Rocks in a park, worn smooth by rain, may hold the buried traces of ancient roots and riverbeds. Fossils in a museum, silent under glass, are pages from the same long story you've just imagined. Now settle in for a moment. Breathe out slowly, letting it fill and empty, as slow and heavy as a tyrannosaur at rest. Imagine the distant thunder of its footsteps, once shaking the floodplain, fading step by step until they blur into the sound of your own heartbeat. The forest darkens, the stars turn, the great head sinks a little deeper into the ferns. Every story, even the mightiest, comes at last to stillness. The king sleeps, the world moves on, and you can drift with it, gently, into silence and into sleep. Sleep well tonight, traveller. Good night.